Welcome to the Cartoon Codex. Tonight we're diving deep into the moments Family Guy quietly admits that reality doesn't matter, and then laughs as it rewrites the rules. You've seen it before. A character dies horribly, the world ends in nuclear fire, or God himself walks through Quahog, and by next week, it's like none of it ever happened. That uneasy feeling you get, that's the show behaving like it knows it can't die. On the surface, it's just an animated sitcom with cutaway gags and cartoon violence. But something happened as the seasons went on. Death stopped being final. Time stopped being linear. The characters started talking to you, arguing with the writers, and treating continuity as a toy they could snap in half whenever the joke demanded it. Fans laugh, but a part of your brain notices the pattern. This isn't just sloppy writing. It's a world that keeps puncturing its own walls. Think about it. Peter has met death multiple times, bargained for his life, and watched the rules of mortality get negotiated like a phone plan. Stewie has erased entire timelines with a time machine that can undo deaths, marriages, even whole episodes. We've seen God lounging in heaven, annoyed by prayers, while the universe bends around his petty decisions. And yet the Griffins still sit on that couch, as if nothing they experience ever truly sticks. How many times can a family survive the end of the world before you start asking what they really are? Here's where things get really interesting. Once you start looking at the show this way, you notice distinct categories of reality breaking. There are the meta-cutaways and fourth wall breaks, where characters complain about the network or reference the writers as if they're trapped employees. There's time travel and hard resets, where Stewie's devices quietly reboot existence. There are encounters with death and God that reveal higher layers of control. There are simulations, dreams, and alternate dimensions where other versions of Quahog rot in apocalyptic states. And beneath it all, there's continuity horror. Deaths, divorces, and catastrophes that vanish without explanation. What you're about to hear isn't just trivia about a long-running cartoon. It's a way of watching Family Guy as if it's a self-aware system, glitching and stuttering, trying to explain its own suffering through jokes. We're going episode by episode, pattern by pattern, and tracing how a show about a dysfunctional family became a catalogue of reality failures, emotional resets, and normalized abuse. So settle in, because this is going to get dark. By the end, you may find it hard to say what canon even means in Quahog. If every death can be undone, every timeline overwritten, and every fourth wall break is a cry for help, are these characters living lives at all, or just replaying the same nightmare forever for our entertainment? The town that remembers nothing. To really feel how broken this world is, you have to start with the place itself. Quahog isn't just a setting. It behaves like a town with no long-term memory, a stage that wipes itself clean every night while you sleep. On the surface, it looks like any other animated sitcom suburb. But once you start looking at what actually happens there, the effect is quietly disturbing. People die in Quahog. Not just background extras, but main characters, beloved faces, entire crowds. Peter gets shot, crushed, blown up, torn apart in elaborate violence that would end any real person's story. The town is leveled by apocalypses, nukes, and cosmic disasters. There are endings where humanity is wiped out, where the last joke plays out over ruins. And then, next week, you're back at Spooner Street. The house is fine, the family is fine, and no one even mentions it. Fans notice this pattern most in Peter's body. He survives being mutilated, dismembered, turned into a vegetable, and the only lasting consequence is a cutaway gag. It's not just cartoon durability, it's the way the show refuses to let any injury leave a scar on the timeline. Stewie builds a time machine, erases deaths, undoes entire episodes. World-ending events are treated like drafts the show didn't save. We're diving deep into a reality where even the apocalypse doesn't stick. That's where continuity horror creeps in. It's not just that things reset. It's that time clearly moves forward. Holidays pass, characters age just enough for new jokes, relationships shift. But the world refuses to remember what it's been through. Imagine living in a town where you subconsciously recall being killed in a cutaway, or watching your family die in one timeline, but waking up the next day acting normal. Wouldn't that gnaw at you, even if you couldn't explain why? Other animated shows do resets, of course. The Simpsons, South Park, and classic cartoons, they all bounce back from violence and absurdity. But something happened with Family Guy after its revival. The reset isn't just a production limitation. It becomes a feature of the subject matter itself. The more abuse Meg takes, the more extreme Stewie's experiments get, the more Brian dies and undies, the more it feels like the universe is aggressively refusing to let consequences accumulate. Here's where things get really interesting. What if this isn't laziness at all? What you're about to hear in later sections is that the constant return to status quo looks less like sloppy writing and more like a simulation reloading a save file or a story engine that will not allow its pieces to escape their roles. Episodes that end in total destruction feel like failed branches, quietly discarded by something above Quahog, or so. Settle in with that thought. If the town can't remember what's happened to it, is that because the people are forgetful, or because something above them keeps hitting undo every time reality breaks a little too far? Cutaways as glitches in the system. If something above Quahog keeps hitting undo, then the most obvious evidence isn't the big apocalypses or the erased deaths. It's the quiet, constant glitches you've trained yourself not to question. The cutaways, the show's signature joke format that, once you start looking at it, behaves less like comedy and more like a system error. On the surface, a typical cutaway is simple. A character makes a comment in the living room or at the Drunken Clam, mentions how something is worse than the time they did X, and instantly, without any transition, you're teleported into a completely different scene, era, or universe. You watch that mini-scene play out. Then the show snaps back to the original conversation as if nothing happened. No one disoriented. No time apparently lost. It feels throwaway, disposable. But something happened. Because those cutaways do not respect time, space, or identity. Peter will suddenly be a factory worker in the 1920s, or a knight, or a background character in some historical atrocity. Stewie will be in a Broadway number with celebrities who, in theory, exist separately from the show. The family becomes different versions of themselves, with different ages, jobs, even species, and there is never an in-universe explanation. How did they get there? When did they come back? Why does nobody remember? Here's where things get really interesting. What if those aren't just jokes, but momentary channel changes? You're not watching a flashback or an imagination bubble. You're watching the show briefly connect to a parallel reality that shares these characters' data, then drop the signal. The trigger is always memory, comparison, or fantasy. This is like when I remember that time. Imagine if, as if the act of thinking is a remote control, flicking through nearby timelines that almost happened. Patterns start to appear. The recurring formats, Peter's endless past jobs, alternate griffins in different art styles, bizarre historical events with the family inserted, begin to look less like isolated gags and more like fragments of overwritten or discarded timelines. Maybe Peter really did work all those jobs. Maybe the griffins really did live through those eras, and those lives just got pushed into the cutaway bin when the operating system of the show decided to re-render canon. And notice how often the cutaways feel more vivid, more detailed, more real than the main plot. Elaborate sets, specific costumes, fully choreographed musical numbers, emotionally coherent little stories that last 15 seconds and are never mentioned again. It's as if the show is more comfortable outside its own supposed continuity, like the real Quahog is the glitch, and these side worlds are the stable versions struggling to break through. What you're about to hear later in this video is that the cutaways line up disturbingly well with the time travel, the multiverse episodes, and even the appearances of God and death. Are these really just jokes? Or are they the operating system of Family Guy's reality leaking through the cracks, showing you every life this family almost lived and then erased? When the characters notice the camera, and once you start looking at those erased lives, another pattern appears. Sometimes, the characters don't just live inside the joke. They look straight past it. They look at you. This is where the fourth wall starts to crack. In most sitcoms, a fourth wall break is a playful wink. In Family Guy, it's a recurring reminder that the characters know, at least dimly, that they are being watched, written, adjusted. Peter grumbles about the network not letting them show things. Stewie complains about how long the cutaways are. Characters argue about episode structures, continuity, and even the budget. On the surface, it's meta humor. But something happened when these moments piled up over decades. You start to notice how often they reference the show itself as a show. Peter will say, "That's worse than the time Fox cancelled us." And the scene will hard cut to real-world DVD box art. Stewie will roll his eyes and ask why they're wasting time on another irrelevant cutaway when there's a plot going on. Brian will literally tell the audience, "If you're just tuning in, this is basically our reset button." It's funny the first time. By the 50th time, it feels like trapped people describing their own cage. Because if you take these moments seriously, even for a second, the tone shifts from comedy to psychological horror. Imagine being Stewie and realizing that no matter how advanced your inventions are, you can't escape the fact that you only exist when the writers decide you do. Imagine being Brian, aware enough to talk about ratings, cancellations, and fan backlash, but still forced to walk back into the same living room, the same abuse, the same violence, every week. What does it do to a mind to know you're fictional, but still feel pain, humiliation, and loss as if they're real? Here's where things get really interesting. These meta comments are almost always played for laughs, tossed off as quick gags. But when you're diving deep, they start to form a disturbing pattern. The show keeps reminding you that it knows it's fake, while the characters seem increasingly aware they can't change that. They can complain about the cutaways, but they can't stop them. They can call out lazy writing, but they still have to live inside it. How many times can you acknowledge your own lack of control before that becomes its own kind of torture? And not everyone seems equally awake. Stewie and Brian talk about structure, continuity, even the writers. Peter occasionally references the network or their cancellation, like someone who's seen the edges of the simulation, but doesn't fully understand it. Lois, Meg, and Chris, meanwhile, usually act like standard sitcom characters, rarely engaging with the artificiality around them. It feels like graded awareness, different access levels to whatever passes for reality in Quahog. Some characters get to see the gears, others are just turned by them. So, settle in, because this is going to get dark. When you combine that partial awareness with time travel that rewrites history and literal meetings with God and death, and the line between character and prisoner starts to blur, if they can see the camera, argue with their creators, and watch their own universe reset, what happens when they finally realize who or what is really holding them there? Stewie Griffin, baby, genius, or system admin. And if someone is holding them there, you already know who the prime suspect is. The show practically hands you a name in a high chair, Stewie Griffin. On the surface, he's just the evil baby, a running gag with a British accent and a fixation on matricide. But something happened as the seasons went on. The joke stopped being baby with a vocabulary and quietly became baby with root access to reality. Stewie is the only character with consistent physical access to technology that doesn't just bend logic, it overwrites it. You're not just watching silly sci-fi props. You're watching a time machine that canonically erases deaths, resets history, and spits the family back into a timeline where no one remembers what they lost. You're watching teleportation pads that ignore distance, mind control helmets that rewrite personalities, and doomsday weapons that can level cities or, in some timelines, wipe out humanity entirely. Only for the next episode to act like none of it ever occurred. What you're about to hear is where things stop feeling like cartoon physics and start feeling like system administration. Stewie doesn't just survive this unstable world, he debugs it. When Brian dies in Life of Brian, the grief is played straight, the subject matter is heavy, and the show leans into real mourning. Then Stewie tears open the timeline, drags in a replacement Brian from another universe, and seals the breach. The family moves on as if their original dog never existed. Fans can explain it as a stunt, but within the logic of the show, that's a god-tier intervention. Once you start looking at Stewie this way, he becomes less a character and more a privileged user in a broken simulation. Everyone else in Quahog just runs on whatever script the writers throw at them. Abuse escalates, violence resets, continuity dissolves. Stewie, meanwhile, literally sees the multiverse, catalogues alternate Griffins, and chooses which version of reality to live in. Road to the Multiverse doesn't just show off visual styles. It shows you that Stewie can browse universes the way you browse streaming services. How many timelines has he closed, corrupted, or abandoned without telling anyone? Here's where things get really interesting and dark. For all his power, Stewie is profoundly lonely. His closest bond is with Brian, the one other character who half understands what's happening. And even that relationship flickers between affection and cruelty. Stewie's unstable identity, the constant shifts between murderous villain, insecure child, and theatrical comic relief, feel less like inconsistent writing and more like a mind cracking under too much awareness of an untrustworthy world. If you could see your family die, rewind it, and be the only one who remembered, would you still feel real? So settle in, because we're diving deep into the episodes where Stewie stops being a spectator and becomes an editor. In the next sections, we'll follow his time travel arcs, his multiverse trips, and the moments where he doesn't just survive reality breaking, He causes permanent fractures the show never fully admits. The first time Stewie broke time. And to see Stewie step from spectator to editor, you have to go back to one of the first times he literally rewrites the script, the courtship of Stewie's father, where the time machine isn't just a gag, it's a weapon aimed at the past. On the surface, it plays like a simple wish fulfillment story. Stewie wants better memories with Peter, so he does what any emotionally neglected cartoon infant with godlike tech would do. He changes history. The setup is deceptively sweet. Peter and Stewie bond over abusing Lois, then decide they should have been friends all along. That regret becomes the justification to fire up the time machine and jump back to Stewie's infancy, where Peter can fix their relationship. You watch them sabotage Lois, pull pranks, reshape key family moments, and the show frames it as a father finally showing up for his son. But something happened the second that machine turned on. The original timeline quietly died. Here's where things get really interesting once you start looking at the mechanics. The episode casually shows branching timelines, altered events, and two Stewies existing at once. One baby, one time-traveling saboteur, without pausing to explain what that means. Every prank they pull overwrites the version of reality where it never happened. When they finally return, the present is now the edited cut of their lives, and the show just expects you to accept that the old version, the one you watched for multiple seasons, has been replaced like a bad first draft. And the disturbing part is how reversible it all feels. Stewie treats time like a DVR. If something hurts, you rewind. If something's embarrassing, you erase it. The subject matter is abuse, neglect, and emotional damage. But the solution is a bright, glowing machine that says those things never had to count. The implications are massive. For every fixed timeline, there's another where Peter and Stewie never reconciled, where Lois remembers everything, where the violence and cruelty stuck. Those universes don't get a punchline. They just stop being real. And yet, no one carries the weight of that. Not Stewie, who essentially commits quiet reality homicide. Not Peter, who blunders through universes like they're disposable sets. Not Lois, whose memories and experiences are overwritten without consent. The family wakes up in a preferred cut of their lives, and the show never asks the obvious question. What happened to the people in the discarded version who thought they were the real Griffins? What you're about to hear in the later time travel episodes only escalates this pattern. But the horror is already here. This is going to get dark, because once you accept that Stewie can casually delete timelines we see on screen, you have to ask a final, uncomfortable question before we move on. If this is how lightly the show treats its first big temporal fracture, how many worlds has he quietly erased that we never even got to watch die? Timeline resets. The invisible body count. If Stewie casually deleting a timeline on screen feels heavy, what you're about to hear is worse. That might be the merciful version, and because at least we got to see that world die. Most of the time, Family Guy doesn't even give its universes a funeral. They just stop being real. In this show, a timeline reset can look deceptively harmless. A character wakes up and says, "Wow, what a crazy dream." An episode ends with someone undoing the big decision that drove the plot. Stewie and Brian jump into the time machine, push a few buttons, and suddenly, the last 22 minutes never happened. On the surface, it feels like standard cartoon logic, the same elastic reality you grew up with. But something happened when Family Guy started leaning on this trick over and over. It stopped being a gag and started looking like a pattern of quiet annihilation. Once you start looking at it, you can see different flavors of reset layered through the series. There are explicit rewinds, where we literally watch time reverse, or hear a character say they went back and fixed everything. There are implied do-overs, where a world-ending disaster or mass death plays out, only for the next episode to behave as if it was a non-event, never referenced again. And then there are the soft reboots, the ones fans notice years later, when a major change to a character's history, a relationship, or even a death is simply ignored, overwritten by a new truth the show presents, with a straight face. Every one of those resets has an invisible body count. For the characters, it's just Tuesday. For the universe that just got overwritten, it's the end of all experience. Every background extra crushed in a cutaway, every version of Quahog that got nuked, flooded, or consumed by violence in a finale that wasn't. Those people only exist for as long as the writers feel like remembering them. The moment Stewie flips a switch, or the camera pulls back and says, "It was all a dream," an entire history is quietly declared non-canon and left to rot off screen. In serious sci-fi, this is treated as tragedy. Think about how other shows linger on paradox, on the horror of erasing a life that technically never was. Family Guy does the same thing, and then uses it as a punchline. A city dies, time rewinds, everyone shrugs and goes back to abuse, violence, and cutaway gags. That contrast is exactly why we're diving deep into this subject matter. The more casually the show treats the death of realities, the more disturbing those deaths start to feel. Here's where things get really interesting, and the casualness might be the point. By playing resets for laughs, the show quietly normalizes the idea that reality itself is disposable, that entire timelines can be rolled back for ratings, for a joke, or to undo a creative decision that made fans too upset. No one has to answer for it. Not Stewie, not death, not God, not even the writers when they step on screen. And if that sounds abstract, it won't stay that way. Because very soon, we're going to look at the moments where the reset isn't just theoretical. The episodes where a main character dies, the world grieves, and then reality itself is bent until they walk through the front door again. The death and return of Brian, the impossible survivals, the erased marriages and retcon traumas. Those aren't just continuity errors. They're crime scenes in time, and the bodies are still there if you know where to look. Peter Griffin versus the laws of physics, and if those crime scenes in time have a prime suspect, it's Peter Griffin. On the surface, Peter is just the idiot dad archetype pushed to an extreme. But once you start looking at his relationship with harm, with injury, with death itself, he stops feeling like a person and starts looking like a glitch avatar, a favored process running on corrupted hardware. The more the world shatters, the more he bounces. You've seen it so often that your brain files it under cartoon logic and moves on. Peter falls off a cliff, every bone snapping in a grotesque chain reaction. He's crushed by a falling billboard. He's set on fire, shot, blown up in one of those endless chicken fights that level entire city blocks. By any reasonable standard, there should be a funeral. Instead, next scene, he's back on the couch, beer in hand, like the violence never happened. How many times can a body die without the world acknowledging it? What you're about to hear is that this isn't just slapstick. It's a pattern. When Lois is injured, the show lingers on the pain. When Meg is abused, The emotional damage is the joke. When Brian dies, the grief is treated as real, at least for a while. But Peter's body is a revolving door for catastrophic trauma that never sticks. He's shot in the head and walks it off. He survives nuclear blasts, space, even direct encounters with death as an entity. The universe hurts him loudly, then apologizes quietly. Here's where things get really interesting. Family Guy occasionally wants you to care. It stages serious moments, Peter's addictions, his failures as a husband, his guilt. You're told these have weight, that there are stakes. But seconds later, he's crashing a car through a school, or ripping his arm off in a cutaway, and the laws of physics fold like cardboard. How are you meant to process a heartfelt breakdown from a man who can be dismembered on Monday and fully restored by Tuesday? Fans' darker theories explain this by treating Peter as a privileged thread in Quahog's reality. When the world ends in certain episodes and then silently reboots, Peter is almost always there at the reset point. When Stewie's time machine rewrites history, Peter's status in the family is preserved like a protected variable. Buildings can be destroyed, timelines erased, side characters killed off. But Peter's position in the system snaps back into place. Why does the universe bend around this one man-child? Even Peter seems dimly aware of it. He'll look at the camera and remind you he's the main character, or joke that the show needs him alive. Those meta lines sound throwaway, but in a world where death is a literal character who has personally taken Peter's soul and bargained with him, they start to feel like something else. So, settle in, because Peter's repeated meetings with death might not be accidents at all. They might be negotiations in a much bigger, much darker contract. Meeting death. When the Reaper has a schedule. Because when Peter meets death for the first real time, the show quietly drops the act. On the surface, it looks like a classic Family Guy setup. Peter does something stupid, there's an accident, and suddenly the Grim Reaper is standing in the living room. But what you're about to hear is how that joke quietly rewires the rules of reality in Quahog. Death doesn't arrive as an unknowable force. He walks in like a guy on a house call. Cloak, skeletal hands, sarcastic voice, and a clipboard full of appointments. He calmly explains the rules of dying the way someone might explain a phone plan. Your time was up. This was the scheduled incident. Paperwork's already processed. Then, almost immediately, those rules start to bend. Peter slips. Death gets injured. And just like that, the literal embodiment of mortality is stuck on the Griffin's couch watching TV while the world outside stops dying. Once you start looking at that episode through a darker lens, it stops being funny and becomes quietly disturbing. Death complains about being overworked. He gets annoyed. He flirts. He limps. He can be delayed by a staircase. People across the globe are suddenly immortal not because of a miracle, but because their cosmic caseworker twisted his ankle. If death can be hurt, if his schedule can be interrupted by a domestic accident, what does that say about how fragile the entire system is? We're diving deep here because this is where things get really interesting. Death isn't a natural law in Family Guy. He's customer service. He can be negotiated with, tricked, convinced to give people another chance. Peter bargains for extensions, argues technicalities, and even gets death to resurrect someone as a favor. Fans use these scenes to explain why characters survive impossible violence, why abuse leaves almost no lasting damage, why massive accidents reset by the next week. It's not cartoon logic anymore, it's policy. And Peter, specifically, keeps winning. Most characters in this show just die off-screen, forgotten or erased by the next cutaway. Peter, though, drinks with death, debates him, and walks away with special treatment. Is that just protagonist privilege, or is the universe itself biased toward keeping him alive? In a world where mortality is a negotiable contract, Peter is the client who always gets escalated to a manager. Which leads to the most unsettling question. If death is basically middle management, who's above him? Someone writes the schedule he follows. Someone decides which timelines get rewound, which souls get returned, which destroyed universes from the multiverse stay destroyed. This is going to get dark, because the show doesn't stop at death. It brings in God as an actual character, a being who drinks at bars, watches TV, and casually admits he created this world. So settle in, because when death and God both exist inside a universe that already knows it's a TV show, you have to ask, who are they really working for? And what happens when the writers outrank God? God in Quahog, the writer inside the story. If death is the cleanup crew, then God in Family Guy is the showrunner who walked onto the set. You're not just told he exists. You watch him stroll through Quahog like it's a studio lot, brushing shoulders with the family, commenting on the subject matter, and treating existence like background noise. On the surface, he looks familiar. White robe, long hair, glowing presence. But very quickly, the show strips away the distant, holy image and replaces it with something disturbingly casual. You see God in a bar. You see him on dates. You see him watching TV, flipping channels the way you flip episodes. He complains about being bored. He gets distracted. He makes mistakes, literally causing violence and disasters, then shrugging it off like a bad gag that didn't land. Fans notice how often he behaves like another Quahog guy, with slightly better special effects. He crashes his car while ogling a woman. He sets a bush on fire by accident. He intervenes in human affairs not out of compassion, but because he's amused or annoyed or needs to move the plot along. When he heals someone or rewrites fate, it's framed less as divine mercy and more as a writer punching up a scene that was dragging. Here's where things get really interesting. Once you start looking at these appearances, the overlap between God and the writers becomes hard to ignore. Both sit outside the character's reality. Both can reset outcomes, resurrect people, and treat catastrophic events as entertainment. When the world ends in one episode and quietly reboots in the next, the writers did that on paper. But inside the fiction, it might as well have been God changing his mind between commercial breaks. Is there any real difference? And yet, even God doesn't feel fully in control. There are moments where he hints at rules he can't break, timelines he can't interfere with, or cosmic guidelines he has to follow. He doesn't stop Stewie's time machine from rewriting reality. He doesn't prevent the multiverse from fracturing. He doesn't undo every death. For an all-powerful being, he spends a lot of time acting like middle management in someone else's company. Or what you're about to hear is one of the darker theories. In this universe, God is just another character trapped in the script. Powerful, yes, but still locked inside the same looping continuity horror as Peter, Brian, and Stewie. He can nudge scenes, improvise lines, maybe call for a retake, but he can't stop the episode from airing. So settle in, because this is going to get dark. If even God is a role being played, then who or what is actually writing Quahog's fate? Who sits above a deity who watches TV while you watch him, while someone else watches the ratings? And if the show keeps breaking reality on purpose, Are we sure the highest power in Family Guy is on the screen at all? Or waiting just outside the frame, getting ready to do something worse? Dreams, simulations, and it was all a cutaway. If God might just be another actor in a bigger script, then the next question is obvious. How many layers down are you actually watching from? Because Family Guy doesn't just break reality with gods and writers. It quietly labels whole chunks of its own world as fake, dreams, hallucinations, fantasies, then lets pieces of those fakes leak back into canon. On the surface, that sounds harmless. Every sitcom does the occasional dream sequence, but something happened in Quahog. The dreams, drug trips, and that didn't really happen. Endings stop being throwaway gags and start behaving like test builds of reality. You get Stewie's elaborate fantasies of killing Lois, Brian's anxious visions of dying alone, Peter's anesthesia nightmares and acid trips that run entire acts. The show will spend 10 minutes in a reality and then shrug and say, it was all in their head. Except later, you notice details from those hallucinations quietly reappearing as if the universe remembered them. Fans point to moments where a fantasy becomes a blueprint. Early on, Stewie imagines advanced tech and brutal violence as pure baby delusion. Later seasons give him an actual time machine, working multiverse remote, and on-screen murders that nobody questions. Brian's fear dreams about being replaced and forgotten. They echo disturbingly with Life of Brian, where he dies, is replaced by Vinny, and then is overwritten by time travel. What you're about to hear isn't just trivia. It's the pattern of a show testing realities in dreams before pushing them live. Here's where things get really interesting. Once you start looking at these unreal sequences as simulations, the tone shifts from silly to dark. You're not just watching characters dream. You're watching entities trapped in a world that might itself be a dream of something else. A nested construct. Stewie dreams inside a cartoon that already resets time. Brian hallucinates inside a universe that's already been cancelled and revived. When Peter wakes up and dismisses an entire storyline as a dream, what exactly is he waking up into? A stable reality, or just the next layer of the program? The characters feel it too. They question their sanity, their continuity, their own memories. Peter complains about cutaways, as if he's being yanked out of time. Brian rolls his eyes at retcons, aware that his past has been rewritten. Stewie has full-on existential spirals about whether events count. It's the behavior of people who can feel the edges of the simulation pressing in, but can't quite see the code. And then there are the cutaways themselves. So settle in, because this is going to get dark. Every cutaway can be read as a temporary boot into a different instance of the program. The camera snaps, the art style changes, physics reset, entire new mini-worlds load for a single joke, then are abandoned. Yet sometimes those worlds come back. A throwaway bit returns seasons later, as if that shard of reality never fully shut down. The disturbing theories about Family Guy argue that dreams, trips, and cutaways are all the same function. Micro-simulations branching off a corrupted main timeline. Tonight, how we're diving deep into the episodes that don't just hint at this, but go all in. Alternate universes, multiverse remotes, and timelines where Quahog never comes back. When we get there, the "it was all a dream" excuse stops working, because the nightmare keeps continuing somewhere else. The multiverse episode that said the quiet part out loud, and that brings you to the episode where Family Guy stops hinting and finally says it out loud. Not in a quiet background detail way, but in a bright neon headline. There isn't just one Quahog. There are countless Quahogs, countless Griffins, all running at the same time. On the surface, Road to the Multiverse plays like a flashy sci-fi detour. Stewie builds a device, Brian tags along, and together they hop from universe to universe. Each one a different visual gag. Disney, anime, live action, dog-ruled, apocalyptic. You watch them slide through these realities as if they're channels on a TV. But something happened in that half hour that fans still underestimate. The show doesn't just imply alternate timelines. It takes you on a guided tour of them, catalogues them, and then leaves them running when the camera pulls away. What you're about to hear is why that's quietly one of the darkest things Family Guy has ever done. Every joke universe is presented as complete. People are walking around, economies are functioning, abuse and violence still exist, and then two outsiders crash through, cause chaos, and vanish. The Disney universe doesn't blink out when Stewie and Brian leave. The world where humans are kept as pets doesn't dissolve. The nuclear wasteland stays a nuclear wasteland. And once you start looking at it that way, the tone shifts from wacky adventure to something closer to cosmic trespassing. Here's where things get really interesting. Before this episode, fans could tell themselves that cutaways, non-canon deaths, or bizarre one-off scenarios were just exaggerated jokes. After the multiverse remote, those same moments look different. That universe where Peter is a real cowboy. That black and white noir Quahog. Those aren't throwaway fantasies anymore. They can be read as actual neighboring realities, briefly tuned into by a show that's accidentally honest about how broken its own continuity is. The multiverse framework retroactively cleans up the mess and makes it worse at the same time. It explains why Brian can die in one episode and be fine in another, or why the world can end on Sunday and be back on Monday, why Stewie's inventions don't permanently change anything. If there are infinite branches, then every reset is just a jump. Every contradiction is a universe swap. This is going to get dark, because it means the Prime family you think you're watching might have been abandoned seasons ago. And by confirming the multiverse explicitly, the show quietly hands itself a blank check. Reality can break as hard as it wants. There's always another Quahog to retreat to, another timeline to sacrifice. So, settle in, because later we're diving deep into specific universes from that episode and beyond. The dog-ruled world, the ruined futures, the timelines that never get fixed. When we break those down, and you'll have to ask yourself a disturbing question. Is there even a true Family Guy timeline left? Or are you already watching a replacement? Continuity corpses. When major characters don't stay dead. If the multiverse turned Family Guy's reality into a hall of mirrors, the show's approach to death turns it into a morgue with a revolving door. You're not just watching characters live and suffer anymore. You're watching them die, be mourned, and then casually stroll back in like the funeral was a rehearsal. So settle in, because we need a new phrase for what you're about to hear. Call it a continuity corpse. A character whose death is framed as permanent and devastating, treated as a serious turning point in the story, only for the show to quietly undo it later or pretend it never mattered. On the surface, it looks like shock value, but once you start looking at how often it happens, it starts to feel like the rules of reality themselves are being tested and then discarded. Family Guy has a whole graveyard of these. You get Brian's infamous death in Life of Brian, sold as a sincere goodbye, complete with hospital despair and a replacement dog. You get apocalyptic endings where the world is wiped out, humanity dies in nuclear fire, or Quahog becomes uninhabitable, only for the next episode to open like nothing happened. You get episodes where death literally takes Peter, where God appears, where the afterlife is confirmed, and then all of that cosmic information is treated like a throwaway gag the following week. How many times can the universe end on Sunday and be fine again by next Thursday? Here's where things get really interesting. These moments are not initially framed as jokes. They slow down. The music shifts. Characters cry, beg, bargain. The camera lingers on hospital machines, on ruined landscapes, on coffins and broken families. You're asked to sit in it, to feel something real in a show built on cutaways and violence. And then, later, Stewie's time machine erases it. A new timeline overwrites it, or the writers simply never mention it again, as if your grief was an optional side quest. That creates a specific kind of emotional whiplash. You're trained to believe that nothing in Quahog has consequences, but then the show suddenly demands you care, that you mourn, that you accept a new normal, before yanking you back to status quo. How many times can you be told to take death seriously and then be told, retroactively, that it was just a narrative costume change? At what point do you stop believing anything the show tells you about stakes, trauma, or loss? This is where the horror really settles in. If even death can't anchor the story, if funerals, apocalypses, and divine encounters are all negotiable, then reality in Family Guy isn't a rule set, it's a mood. The universe can reset on a whim. Characters can resurrect without explanation, and the only constant is that nothing is constant. And one death and return, more than any other, exposed that machinery so plainly that fans couldn't unsee it. You already know which one it is. But are you ready to hear what it actually did to the show's reality? Laughter as a cover-up. How jokes hide the horror. And you're right to feel that something broke there. Because if you zoom out from that one death and return, you start to see a pattern the show has been quietly building for years. Cutaways that act like glitches in the feed. Time travel that rewinds pain. Death and God showing up like mildly annoyed office workers. Whole episodes revealed as dreams, simulations, or alternate dimensions. Continuity corpses left behind every time the story sheds a skin. On the surface, all of that plays as comedy. It's framed as harmless nonsense, a way to jump to a Star Wars parody or a talking cow without having to explain anything. But once you start looking at how often those breaks in reality happen right after something dark or disturbing, it stops feeling like harmless nonsense and starts looking like a strategy. And the show does something cosmically horrifying and then immediately buries it under a joke. Think about it. Stewie erases entire timelines with his time machine, undoing deaths, relationships, whole branches of reality. And the punchline is usually Brian making a sarcastic comment. Peter meets death, literally negotiates his lifespan, and the takeaway is a cutaway gag about some celebrity. The world ends in one episode, humanity is wiped out in another, Quahog is destroyed more than once, and by next week the family is back on the couch like nothing happened. The violence lands, the abuse lands, and then the reset button lands harder. Over time, that does something to you as a viewer. You're trained to laugh instead of process, to move on instead of question, to accept that nothing you just saw will truly matter, because if it gets too heavy, the show will just cut away, reboot, or blame it on a dream. Theories about Stewie's fractured mind or the show existing in a broken simulation feel compelling partly because they explain why your own emotional responses keep getting yanked away at the last second. Here's where things get really interesting. What you're about to hear in the next parts of this video assumes that this isn't just sloppy writing or lazy gags. It assumes intent. It assumes the show is actively conditioning you to be comfortable with reality being unstable, with consequences dissolving, with the idea that any horror can be shrugged off if it's followed quickly enough by a joke. This is going to get dark, but we're diving deep into that possibility, so settle in. We're not inventing clues. We're just following the ones the show has already laid out, then pretended not to notice. The cutaways, the multiverse trips, the erased deaths, the meetings with God and death. Family Guy keeps drawing the same pattern, then erasing it in front of you. In the next sections, we'll stop treating those as isolated jokes and start treating them as evidence, like log files from a system that keeps crashing and rebooting. And once you read the logs, can you ever unsee what the machine's been doing? From trivia to theory, how we're reading the glitches. So now that you've seen the logs, the cutaways, the resets, the meetings with higher powers, we have to make a shift. Up to this point, we've been walking you through the crime scene style layout of Family Guy's broken reality, just describing what's there. From here on, we're diving deep into what it might actually mean that this show keeps committing the same reality violations over and over again. On the surface, you've just watched a highlight reel of strange jokes, fourth wall breaks, erased deaths, impossible timelines, God showing up like a bored neighbor. But something happened when you lined them up in your head. They stopped feeling like isolated gags and started looking like a pattern. So, settle in, because what you're about to hear is less episode guide and more operating manual for a universe that does not want to make sense. To keep this from turning into pure chaos, we're going to use a simple framework, 4 lenses that we'll keep coming back to. First, meta-reality. Every time a character knows they're in a show, talks to the writers, or reacts to a cutaway, as if it's a physical event. That's where the characters themselves brush against the edge of the screen and feel that something is watching them. Second, temporal instability. Stewie's time machine, the life of Brian reset. Episodes where the world ends on Sunday night and is fine again by next week. That's where time stops being a straight line and turns into a looped, abusable resource. Third, cosmic hierarchy. Death as a recurring side character. God as a flawed sitcom extra. The afterlife treated like another set. These are the moments that quietly explain who outranks who in this disturbing universe, and how small the Griffin family really is compared to whatever's running the simulation. And fourth, structural anomalies. The multiverse trips, the dream episodes, the timelines that contradict each other so hard they feel like different shows stapled together. That's where we ask whether Quahog is one town, or a cluster of overlapping realities bleeding into each other. From this point on, every major break in reality won't just be a funny moment we replay. It becomes a data point. When Stewie erases a death, when Peter survives impossible violence, when Meg's abuse resets without scars, we'll treat those not as lazy writing, but as clues to a hidden architecture, a set of rules that explain why nothing ever really ends here, and why that's so unsettling once you start looking at it. And no, we're not abandoning the humor. The jokes are the map. We'll follow where they repeat, where they escalate, where they contradict themselves, and we'll ask, if the same dark punchline keeps coming back across different timelines, is that just a running gag or evidence of a larger design? From here, the tone is going to tighten. The speculation will get darker, the connections more precise, the implications more like psychological horror than comfort TV. But the delivery will stay calm, almost like someone reading you a bedtime story about a family that can never wake up. So as we move into meta-reality, then time, then gods, then simulations, hold on to one question. If Family Guy keeps breaking reality again and again, is that a glitch in the system, or the real point of the show? The day Peter met God. Again and again. So if the last section cracked open the idea of meta-reality, this is where Family Guy calmly walks you up to the source code. Because in this show, God isn't a distant idea. He's a guy Peter keeps running into like a neighbor with admin access. On the surface, those encounters play as throwaway gags. Peter on a hospital bed after one of his usual acts of cartoon violence, casually chatting with a very literal God about whether he should live or die. Peter meeting God at a bar, trading small talk and relationship advice like this is the most normal thing in the world. God strolling through Quahog traffic to cause a car accident because he's distracted by a woman. No choirs, no revelation. Just a background character who happens to control reality. Once you start looking at these scenes together, they stop feeling like jokes and start feeling like documentation. This God has preferences, moods, a recognizable voice and face. He complains, he dates, he gets annoyed, he directly intervenes when the plot needs a nudge, then disappears when the subject matter gets too dark. Fans notice that he isn't framed as an unknowable force. He's more like a logged-in user with higher permissions. Here's where things get really interesting. His power level and memory keep changing. In one episode, he can resurrect, smite, and rewrite outcomes with a snap. In another, he seems limited, petty, even forgetful of past interactions with Peter and the family. Sometimes he remembers conversations. Sometimes he acts like they've never met. Are we supposed to believe an all-knowing being just loses track? Or are we watching a character whose own continuity is being patched between builds of the same broken world? That instability leads to a darker theory. Peter's proximity to God isn't just a running gag. It's access. He's the crash test dummy the system keeps pulling data from. Why does Peter get the hospital bed audience, the bar talks, the direct negotiations over life, death, and consequence, while Meg just absorbs endless abuse in silence? Why does this one character, out of everyone in Quahog, repeatedly brush against the person who can flip the switch? Think about the moments where God literally changes outcomes. He saves people arbitrarily, punishes others for minor things, and in some scenes effectively rewinds events so the show can continue. When you connect that to earlier continuity horror, the erased deaths, the undone trauma, the world-ending events that never stick, you start to see a pattern. This isn't divine mystery. It's version control. So settle in, because what you're about to hear isn't really about religion at all. And these meetings play less like spiritual encounters and more like tech support calls in a collapsing simulation. A user, Peter, breaks reality. The admin, God, steps in just enough to keep the program running, but never enough to fix the underlying violence or abuse. And that raises a disturbingly simple question. If God can drop into Quahog any time he wants, why does he let the worst breaks in reality continue? What if the suffering, the resets, the contradictions aren't glitches he missed, but stress tests he designed? In the next section, we'll follow that thought all the way down. Death as a recurring character. and a system process. If God is running stress tests, then death is the technician who keeps getting called in after the system crashes. And once you start looking at his episodes through that lens, they stop feeling like quirky side stories and start looking like error logs. On the surface, death showing up in Family Guy seems straightforward. He's a skeleton in a robe. He talks like a bored office worker. He swings by when someone's time is up. But something happened the first time he really got involved with the Griffins. In Death is a Bitch, he breaks his ankle in their living room and has to stay with the family, which means no one on Earth can die. Planes crash without casualties. People blow themselves up and just stand back up. Mortality becomes a pause process, not a fundamental rule. You're watching the kill switch of the universe get stuck in the off position. Then you get Death Lives, where Peter cheats death literally. He's supposed to die in a golf accident, but death ends up negotiating with him, walking him through flashbacks like a customer support rep trying to justify a cancellation fee. Later, in Meet the Quagmires, Death casually offers Peter a trip back to the 80s, like a system admin rolling back to a previous restore point. Time, fate, the order of events, everything the show's reality is built on, suddenly looks negotiable if you know the right person in the department. We're diving deep into something darker here. Death keeps failing. He gets injured. He gets distracted. He gets tricked. He lets Peter talk him into delays and exceptions. That doesn't just make him funny. It implies that the rules of life and death in Quahog are not absolute. They're processes that can hang, glitch, or be manually overridden. If death can be taken out by a twisted ankle, what does that say about the stability of everything he's supposed to manage? Here's where things get really interesting. Characters in this show can die, meet death, bargain, and then stroll back into normal life with no lasting trauma, no changed behavior, not even a clear memory of what happened. Peter dies and returns. Brian dies in another arc and comes back through time travel. The violence and abuse keep escalating, but the emotional registers stay flat. It's as if the system restores from backup and wipes the logs every time, leaving only faint, disturbing echoes for fans to notice. So, settle in with this idea. Every time you see death, you're not just seeing a gag. You're seeing the crash handler. The pop-up that appears when reality throws an exception. He arrives, tries to close the process, maybe rolls back a timeline. It then disappears so the show can pretend everything is normal again. There's an eerie comfort in that, isn't there? Even death is overworked, underinformed, and clearly not the one who wrote the code he's enforcing. And this is going to get dark, because once death looks like middle management, you have to ask the question the show never answers out loud. If he's just following orders, who or what is actually deciding when Quahog resets and when it doesn't? The Griffin House, that remembers what the family forgets. If death is just middle management, then you have to look around and ask, what's the actual office? What piece of this world never really changes, no matter how many times reality snaps in half? And what you're about to hear is that the answer might be quietly sitting at 31 Spooner Street. On the surface, the Griffin House is background art, a 2-story cartoon box with a green roof, yellow siding, and that familiar red door you've seen so often your brain can trace it with your eyes closed. But once you start looking at what happens to it, the house stops feeling like set dressing and starts feeling like a witness. Fires, explosions, alien invasions, apocalyptic cutaways, even full-on multiverse collapses tear through Quahog. Peter drives a car through the living room. Chicken fights level entire city blocks. There are episodes where the world literally ends. And yet, by next week, the siding is clean, the windows are intact, the roofline is perfect again. You notice the pattern most in the interior. The living room with the green couch facing the TV. The stairs rising up on the left. The same frame pictures, the same color palette, the same oddly comforting emptiness of the walls. Jobs change, relationships implode. Brian dies and undies via time travel. Stewie's inventions rewrite history, but that couch is waiting. That TV is centered. That staircase is frozen in place like a ritual object. Fans can track whole eras of the show by how cruel the characters become, how much abuse and violence the subject matter leans into, but the layout barely twitches. So, settle in, because here's where things get really interesting. If Stewie's time machine can reboot timelines, and death can punch someone's ticket on command, the house starts to look like a save point. A default template the simulation quietly reloads after every major break in continuity. The characters forget, the house does not. Catastrophic damage is treated like a gag, then wiped. But the structure returns to its base model, like a game reloading your last safe configuration after a crash. Every once in a while, though, the mask slips. There are episodes where scorch marks linger for a single scene, then vanish without explanation. A wall will be cracked from last week's violence, only to be pristine the moment the camera angle changes. A strange object appears on a shelf, referencing a previous episode the characters never acknowledge again. Entire rooms materialize, a basement that exists for one disturbing storyline, an extra bedroom used once for a dark joke, and then are quietly erased from canon, as if the house tried on a memory and the simulation forced it to revert. Even the way the show is filmed betrays an obsession with stability. The camera returns to the same angles over and over. The living room wide shot, the kitchen table, the upstairs hallway. No matter how wild the multiverse gets outside, we're diving deep into the same 3 or 4 vantage points. Like whatever runs this reality needs fixed anchors to keep the whole thing from unraveling. And this is going to get dark, because once you start treating the Griffin house as a patient, enduring presence, it starts to feel like the only thing that actually experiences every timeline in full. What if Quahog doesn't orbit its people at all? What if Peter, Lois, Stewie, Brian, Meg, and Chris are just variables being reloaded inside a single, unblinking structure? The true anchor point of their reality, quietly remembering every version of the family that never remembers it back. When the world ends, and nobody remembers. And once you start looking at Quahog as the real constant, you notice something else. That constant keeps dying. The town gets wiped out. Civilization collapses. Humanity ends in fire or plague or silence. And then, next week, everyone's back at the Drunken Clam like nothing happened. On the surface, these look like one-off experiments. A nuclear blast here, a viral outbreak there, an alternate future where the Griffins are wandering through wastelands instead of cul-de-sacs. You get irradiated Quahog, burned out skylines, highways buried in ash. You get Peter leading scavenger gangs, Lois turning into a hardened survivor, Chris and Meg treated less like punchlines and more like liabilities. The show doesn't just hint at the apocalypse, it moves in, redecorates, and lets you live there for 22 minutes. Think about how often the world ends around this family. There are nukes launched in petty arguments. Bioweapons and diseases tear through the population. Giant disasters, cosmic resets, alternate futures where the Griffins are among the last people standing. the tone slows down, the laughter track in your own head gets quieter, and the subject matter suddenly feels less like edgy comedy and more like a stress test. How far can this reality bend before it snaps? Here's where things get really interesting. These aren't quick dream sequences. The show builds full new status quos, post-apocalyptic neighborhoods, new rules, new power structures. Characters shift in ways that would permanently scar a real person. Peter becomes crueler in a way that isn't funny anymore. Lois becomes colder. Stewie's violence stops being a gag and starts feeling like policy. Then, with no in-universe explanation, it all just evaporates. No time machine. No, it was all a dream. No God pressing a reset button on screen. The next episode opens, the grass is green again, and no one mentions the bodies. Fans have theories to explain this, and what you're about to hear is much darker than a simple, non-canon episode label. If Quahog is the anchor, these end-of-the-world stories start to look like sandbox timelines, temporary branches where the system runs extreme simulations, pushes the characters into maximum violence and abuse, then discards the data and reloads the last stable save. So settle in, because we're diving deep into a version of Family Guy, where the apocalypse is just another background process. Visually, and the show even tells you when you've slipped into one of these branches. The color palette goes muddy and desaturated. Skies turn from bright sitcom blue to sickly grey. Shots linger a little longer. Jokes are spaced out, replaced with long, uncomfortable walks through ruined streets, or with deaths that feel too slow for a cartoon. This is going to get dark, and the animators lean into it. The psychological horror comes from what happens after. Imagine surviving nuclear winter with your family, watching neighbors starve, watching your town become unrecognizable, and then being overwritten by a lighter, earlier copy of yourself, who goes bowling and never feels that weight. If the system can end the world, harvest the experience, and then boot up a version of Peter who only remembers a cutaway gag, or what does that make the Peter who watched everyone die? Once you start looking at these apocalypses as disposable test runs, a new question creeps in. Who, inside the show, seems to know they're temporary and behaves like the end of the world is never really the end? Stewie, the child who knows too much. Inside this collapsing maze of timelines, one person always twitches first. Not Peter, not Brian. A baby, Stewie Griffin. On the surface, Stewie is a joke. A football-shaped head, British affect, and a revolving door of violence and melodrama. But once you start looking at how he actually behaves, he stops feeling like comic relief and starts feeling like the one character who understands the rules of the game. Hyper-intelligent, obsessed with control, surrounded by advanced technology no one else even questions, Stewie moves through the show like a tiny systems analyst trapped in a daycare. He builds time machines, multiverse remotes, mind control guns, memory erasers. Devices that, in any other series, would permanently change the world. Here, they reset it. And Stewie notices. He doesn't just crack jokes about it. He comments on the pacing of episodes, calls out cutaways, and complains when the plot structure wastes his time. How many babies do you know who get annoyed that the A-plot is dragging? There are moments where Stewie directly acknowledges the show's format, treating commercial breaks, act structure, and even the opening theme as obstacles he has to work around. He rolls his eyes when a cutaway interrupts him. He references the writers as if they're an invasive species. He'll tell Brian, in a strangely calm tone, and that none of this matters because the episode will just end and they'll be back on the couch. What you're about to hear is less a gag and more a confession. Stewie behaves like someone who has read the script and is tired of pretending he hasn't. And then there are his memories. Think about the timelines he's erased. Brian's death in Life of Brian, the catastrophes undone by his time machine, the realities abandoned in Road to the Multiverse. The show shrugs and moves on. But Stewie doesn't always fully reset. Sometimes he's grieving events no one else recalls. Sometimes he flinches at dangers that technically never happened. Why does a child look traumatized by a past the universe insists is gone? Here's where things get really interesting. If you frame his inventions as desperate attempts at agency, they stop being wacky sci-fi props and start looking like survival tools. The time machine isn't just a vehicle for jokes. It's Stewie clawing at the walls of a prison that keeps rearranging itself. The multiverse remote isn't a toy. It's proof he suspects this reality is only one node in a much darker network. This is going to get dark because the horror isn't that Stewie is evil. It's that he's aware. A child intelligent enough to see the glitches, but small enough to be ignored, dismissed, or overwritten whenever the system decides to start over. He's the canary in the coal mine of Quahog, the first to panic when the simulation's seams begin to show, the only one who understands that an apocalypse might just be a Tuesday. So settle in, because his most dangerous creation, the time machine, doesn't just let him escape reality breaks. It may be the thing that shattered reality beyond repair. The time machine that shouldn't exist. Stewie's time machine is presented like a toy, a glowing, humming shortcut out of any problem. But once you start looking at how it actually operates in the show, you realize it isn't a toy at all. It's a loaded gun pointed at the spine of reality. On the surface, the early uses feel almost innocent. In The Big Bang Theory, Stewie and Brian chase Bertram through time, accidentally meddling with Stewie's own conception and the literal origin of the universe, then slip back into a present that's mostly the same. In Road to Germany, they rescue Mort from 1939 and casually rewrite World War II. Each time, they return to Quahog as if nothing happened, but the air feels off. A line of dialogue is different. A relationship has shifted, and the show never fully explains what changed, only that something did. Sometimes, Family Guy pretends there are rules. You get paradoxes, branching timelines, the idea that if Stewie interferes with a fixed event, everything collapses. Back to the Pilot leans into this. Multiple Brians and Stewies pile up, each new interference spawning another splintered path, until the episode has to literally massacre its own duplicates to restore order. That's strict, almost anxious time travel logic. But then, in other episodes, the machine is treated like a casual reset button, a loose convenience that erases divorces, injuries, even global events with no visible cost. Those two approaches cannot coexist in a stable universe. They describe different physics. Here's where things get really interesting. The show keeps destroying the time machine, and Stewie melts it down, vows to decommission it, or claims it's gone forever. In The Big Bang Theory, it's blown apart. In other episodes, he swears off time travel because it's too dangerous. And yet, a few weeks later, it's just back. No rebuilding montage, no explanation. Almost as if the larger system that runs Quahog quietly restores a critical piece of its own infrastructure whenever the characters try to unplug it. Every major time travel story leaves behind disturbing loose ends. Who remembers what? In Back to the Pilot, Brian gains knowledge of his own future death. Is that the same Brian we've been watching, or a replacement from a slightly different branch? Which version of 9/11, of Stewie's childhood, of the Griffin family's abuse and violence is actually real? Why do some changes, like character growth, simply evaporate, while others, like certain injuries, grudges, or throwaway gags, seem to stick? Some fans have a darker theory to explain this patchwork. What you're about to hear is less Stewie built a time machine and more Stewie found the controls. The device in his room might be hardware wrapped around a deeper, pre-existing time function, baked into the world itself, something he accessed rather than invented. That would explain why it reappears, why it overrides death, why the universe bends around it instead of breaking completely. So, settle in, because this is going to get dark. If that theory is right, every time Stewie pulls that lever, he isn't just changing his life. He's sending error signals through the entire simulation of Quahog, forcing the show to improvise new continuity on the fly. And the worst glitches show up when the machine stops tweaking background details and starts killing main characters, then desperately trying to pretend it never happened. The death of Brian and the timeline that wouldn't stay dead. And then the machine stops glitching in the background and does something bolder. It walks into the middle of the road and lets a car hit Brian. You remember that episode differently, don't you? Life of Brian doesn't frame his death as a gag or a cutaway or a cartoonish bit of violence. On the surface is played straight. A quiet street, a distracted dog, the sound of impact that lasts a half-second too long. No wacky music, no reset. Just Stewie screaming and the family standing over a body that, in this reality, isn't supposed to get back up. We're diving deep into that choice, and because the show doesn't immediately flinch, they hold a funeral, they cry. Peter gives a sincere eulogy. The subject matter is treated with an almost uncomfortable seriousness, as if the writers are daring you to believe this time it counts. Then Vinny appears, a replacement dog, written as earnest and loyal, moving into Brian's bed, Brian's chair, Brian's opening credits slot. For a few episodes, the entire structure of the family is rewritten around a missing character. Here's where things get really interesting. Family Guy commits, at least theatrically, to the bit. The opening sequence is altered. Vinny bonds with Stewie. The show leans into grief, into adjustment, into the disturbing idea that this world can permanently amputate one of its core characters and just keep going. They even did press insisting Brian was gone for good. You were meant to accept a new timeline. But something happened outside the show. Fans revolted. Petitions spread. Comment sections filled with outrage, not over some edgy joke, but over the removal of the one character who still pretended to care about morality. And then, almost immediately, Stewie remembers. He had a time machine. He hunts down an earlier version of himself, steals the tech back, and travels to the exact moment of the accident to shove Brian out of the way. In universe, it's a simple fix. Out of universe, it looks like panic. An entire emotional arc, multiple episodes of grief. Vinny's whole tenure as a character, overwritten in a few minutes of glowing green light. The family never remembers loving Vinny. Their pain is retroactively unnecessary, and the timeline itself apologizes for upsetting the audience and quietly reboots. What you're about to hear is why that feels darker than a cheap rating stunt. Once you start looking at it, Brian's resurrection plays like a reality bending under analytics pressure. The barrier between viewer and narrative thins. If enough people complain, death loses jurisdiction. Mortality becomes a poll. That's the unsettling implication. In Quahog, lives and deaths are subject to popularity metrics, to petitions, to trending outrage. If Brian can be dragged back into existence by collective will, what else is being adjusted between episodes? Which arguments never happened because test audiences hated them? Which injuries were erased because they made the show too bleak, even for this universe? So settle in, because this is going to get dark. Your fan emotion can reach through the screen and rewrite a car accident. How many other timelines died quietly, off camera, every time the audience reacted just strongly enough? The multiverse remote. When channel surfing becomes dimensional hopping, and just when you're getting used to the idea of timelines quietly dying off screen, the show stops rewinding and starts changing the channel entirely. Road to the Multiverse looks, on the surface, like a flashy Stewie and Brian adventure. A tour through different animation styles, different jokes, different versions of the same family. But something happened in that episode that fans still underestimate. Stewie doesn't just build another time machine. He builds a remote that lets him flip between fully formed universes as easily as you flip between late-night reruns while you're trying to fall asleep. What you're about to hear is why that's much darker than it looks. Each click takes them to a new Quahog, with its own rules and moral logic. A Disney universe where everyone breaks into song and the violence is hidden under musical smiles. A Japanese anime world with exaggerated motion and different physics. A dog-dominated timeline where Brian is the privileged majority and humans are pets. A post-apocalyptic future where the Griffin house is just debris in an empty wasteland. The art style changes, but the disturbing implication doesn't. Every one of these places is continuous, populated, and ongoing before they arrive and after they leave. Here's where things get really interesting. The multiverse remote doesn't treat these realities as sacred or mysterious. It treats them as channels, labeled, organized, instantly accessible. There's no ritual, no cosmic gateway, just a bored baby and a talking dog browsing infinity like it's cable. If universes can be stacked, indexed, and skimmed through that casually, what does that say about the value of any one of them? What does it say about theirs? About yours? Once you start looking at the show through that device, all those cutaways you grew up with don't feel like throwaway gags anymore. A character says, "This is worse than the time." And suddenly, you're in a completely different setting, with different rules, different versions of the characters, and then you're snapped back. Theories suggest those aren't just jokes. They might be stray signals from adjacent universes, are tiny, uncontrolled channel flips that Stewie's remote would, in theory, be able to lock onto and hold. And under the comedy, there's a quiet horror. Every universe Stewie and Brian visit is left behind the second the joke lands. The Disney world, the dog world, the apocalyptic world, they don't shut off when the scene ends. They keep going, abandoned, like entire civilizations created just to support a single cutaway, and then condemned to continue without an audience. How many of those musical smiles curdle when no one is watching? The existence of that remote means no version of these characters is definitive. Kind Peter, monstrous Peter, dead Peter, redeemed Peter. They're all equally real, equally disposable configurations in an endless grid of possibilities. Any growth can be overwritten by a universe where it never happened, and any death can be sidestepped by landing on a nearby channel where it hasn't occurred yet. So, settle in, because this is going to get dark. If Stewie can browse other realities like late-night TV, then the reverse is also true in principle. Somewhere out there, another hand could be holding another remote, flicking past his universe, pausing on Quahog just long enough to watch this family suffer, reset, and suffer again, before casually changing the channel. The question is, what happens to their world when that viewer finally decides they've seen enough? The episode that admitted it wasn't canon, and then acted like it was. If some higher viewer can always change the channel on Quahog, then the next disturbing question is this: what happens when the show itself tells you, very calmly, and that what you're about to hear doesn't count, and then behaves like it absolutely does? On the surface, Family Guy tries to reassure you with labels. It's a what if. It's non-canon. It's just a fantasy. Episodes like Road to the Multiverse, Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie, and the anthology specials frame themselves as experiments, side stories, playful genre parodies that live in a safe sandbox away from the main continuity. You're told you can relax. None of this is real. But something happened. Those sealed-off sandboxes started leaking. Road to the Multiverse is pitched as a tour through alternate dimensions, a fun detour where Stewie and Brian visit Disney World Quahog, post-apocalypse Quahog, and a universe where Christianity never existed. Yet after that episode, the idea of countless parallel griffins stops being a one-time gag and quietly becomes infrastructure. Later time travel stories, Brian's death, even throwaway jokes about other timelines all lean on that non-canon road trip as if it laid down real rules of reality. Back to the Pilot is even more blatant. It sells itself as a nostalgia romp, a meta joke about bad early animation and recycled cutaways. But when Stewie and Brian fracture the timeline, create future war, then reset everything, the show is acknowledging something dark. Canon can be overwritten, preserved only as memory. And then, in later episodes, the characters reference events and lines from that supposedly disposable time heist as if they genuinely lived through it. Did they? Or did some version of them leak across? Once you start looking at these fake episodes, you see their fingerprints everywhere. The intense, almost horror-like bond in Brian and Stewie is framed as a bottle episode, a self-contained therapy session in a bank vault that the show barely mentions again. Yet Brian's later confessional moments, his suicidal spirals, Stewie's flashes of genuine attachment, all feel like they remember that night. Anthology episodes introduce background details, running gags, even character traits that mysteriously show up later with no in-universe explanation. The boundary between canon and non-canon becomes porous, like a malfunctioning simulation where test servers and production servers accidentally share the same database. A what-if scenario is just a test, until data from that test starts appearing in live reality. Family Guy trains you to accept this contamination. You're encouraged to laugh it off as clever reference, a wink for attentive fans, even as those winks quietly rewrite what really happened to this family. Over time, long-time viewers feel the psychological wear. Why track continuity if the show itself refuses to honor its own labels? Why care which relationship, which death, which trauma was real, when yesterday's joke timeline can become tomorrow's backstory? This is going to get dark, because it means the characters themselves may not know either. If even the episodes that swear their fantasies can bleed into reality, then from inside Quahog, how would anyone tell the difference between a discarded draft of their life and the one they're actually trapped in? Dreams, drug trips, and shared hallucinations. And that brings you to the episodes that admit their fantasies and still feel more stable than the so-called real ones. So settle in, because we're diving deep into the dreams, drug trips, and coma visions that Family Guy keeps brushing off as nothing. On the surface, these are just stylistic detours. Stewie's fever dream in Stewie Loves Lois, Brian's ayahuasca trip in Brian's a Bad Father, Peter's morphine nightmare after surgery, the extended musical fantasies, the Wizard of Oz homage, the episodes where characters drift under anesthesia or lie in hospital beds while the screen slips into surreal, saturated colors. They're presented as escapes from reality. But something happened when fans started lining them up. They noticed how often those escapes know too much. Again and again, a character in an altered state sees accurate information they shouldn't logically have. Comatose or unconscious. Peter glimpses future dynamics in the family. Stewie's dream logic casually includes references to alternate timelines we only see later in Road to the Multiverse. Brian's drug visions frame him as a failed writer and hypocrite long before the show leans fully into that characterization. What you're about to hear isn't just trivia. It's the disturbing suggestion that the dreams are pulling from somewhere outside the character's own mind. Here's where things get really interesting. If Quahog is a simulation, then a dream might just be a brief disconnect from the main feed, a moment where the system stops rendering the usual sitcom layer and lets another view bleed through. Debug mode, alternate server, backup timeline, and that would explain why these sequences are not just bizarre, but eerily coherent, filled with clean symbolism and consistent rules in a show that usually treats continuity like a joke. Why does the chaos make more sense when someone is unconscious? And then there are the shared hallucinations, whole family fantasy numbers where every character seems to remember the same impossible performance, town-wide visions of apocalypse that everyone reacts to as if they lived them, episodes where Peter and Brian trip together and later reference specific images, as though they watch the same external broadcast. If this were just private brain noise, why is it synchronized? Why does it behave like a networked experience instead of isolated delusion? Once you start looking at the craft, it gets darker. The visual style in these altered state episodes echoes earlier reality breaks. The same echoing reverb in the sound design, the same slow zooms, the same unnervingly smooth camera moves used when death appears or when Stewie tears open time. The pacing calms down, the cutaways stop, the violence pauses, and for a few minutes the show feels focused, almost honest. That's where the bedtime story unease creeps in. You know that feeling when you wake from a dream that felt more real than your day, and the morning light seems thin and fake by comparison. Family Guy keeps staging that moment, then insisting you laugh it off. But what if it's backwards? What if the drug trips, the comas, the musical numbers are the only times the system drops its laugh track and shows its true face? And waking up is just logging back into the lie. Because if the dreams are the honest channel, then the next step is asking, who's broadcasting them? And why do the characters only glimpse them when they're closest to death? When live action bleeds in. And once you start looking at those honest channels, you notice something even stranger. Sometimes the signal doesn't just glitch inside the cartoon. Sometimes a completely different medium bleeds through. On the surface, the live action bits in Family Guy feel like cheap, lazy time fillers. Fans joke about the Conway Twitty cutaways, those long, unbroken stretches of real concert footage where the animated world just stops. Peter sets up a gag. The screen hard cuts to grainy video of Conway on stage, And you sit there while an entirely different show plays inside this one. It's absurdist humor, sure, but visually, dear, it's something darker. Two incompatible realities sharing the same frame. We're diving deep into those moments where the animation doesn't just reference live action, it yields to it. Think about the times you see live action Peter, a real man in a cheap green pants and white shirt cosplay, suddenly inserted into a scene. Or when the Griffin living room dissolves and you're watching actual news footage, real explosions, real crowds, dropped into a space that usually resets every 22 minutes. The subject matter can be mundane or ridiculous, but the ontology shock is the same. The rules of Quahog are quietly overwritten by footage from somewhere else. Here's where things get really interesting. The characters often react as if they feel this intrusion, even if they don't fully understand it. Peter will introduce Conway Twitty, and then stand there, frozen in the last frame before the cut, as if his body has been paused while some external system streams in filler. Other times, you see them waiting impatiently for a bit to end, sighing or complaining when a live-action segment runs too long, like workers aware that their shift has been interrupted by an announcement from a higher floor. How do you complain about time being wasted if you're not dimly aware that something outside you is controlling the clock? If earlier sections painted Family Guy as a simulation, these moments start to look like brief windows into the host reality, the one running the program that contains this family, their abuse, their violence, their loops. What you're about to hear isn't just media studies language. It's a way to explain why the system can suddenly swap out everything. Art style, a frame rate, even physical laws, without anyone in-universe authorizing it. The show behaves like software that can load an entirely different asset pack on command. This is going to get dark when you focus on how unsettling it actually is. To see an animated character share space with a human actor, your brain knows those layers shouldn't touch. One is drawn, weightless, consequence-proof. The other is filmed, aging, mortal. When they overlap, even for a second, it feels like the barrier between fiction and reality has been temporarily disabled, as if the quarantine has failed. So, settle in with that thought. If live action can invade the cartoon so easily, what would it look like if something from Quahog ever managed to cross over in the other direction and refused to go back at the Griffin family as re-rolled characters? And if something from Quahog did escape, which version of it would you even get? Because there isn't just one Peter, one Lois, one Stewie. There are dozens layered on top of each other, like failed drafts you were never supposed to see. On the surface, the Griffin family looks stable. Same house, same voices, same silhouettes on the couch. But once you start looking at how these characters behave across seasons, it stops feeling like continuity and starts feeling like re-rolls. Peter has been a barely functioning idiot, a sudden savant, a factory worker, a fisherman, a toy maker, a ship captain, a brewery employee, and inexplicably competent whenever the joke needs him to be. His intelligence slider moves from brain damaged to secretly strategic, with no in-universe explanation, as if reality is testing which version gets the biggest reaction. Lois shifts even more disturbingly. In some episodes, she's the moral center, exasperated but grounded, trying to protect the family from Peter's violence and the show's subject matter. In others, she's a thrill-seeking former kleptomaniac, a neglectful mother, or an outright predator who cheats, lies, and encourages abuse. Meg goes from invisible loser to pop star, cult figure, or sudden beauty, only for the universe to snap her back to punching bag status the next week. Chris alternates between oblivious fool and strangely perceptive observer who can see the darkness around him a little too clearly. Stewie might be the most obvious re-roll. We've seen him as a pure evil baby, as a closeted, anxious theatre kid, as a time-travelling war criminal, and as a softened, almost normal toddler. His sexuality is teased, denied, explored, and reset, like the show is flipping switches in the background. Brian's identity crisis goes even deeper. He's a dog, but also a failed writer, an alcoholic, a moral voice, and a hypocrite, dying and returning as if the species slider itself is glitched. Is he a pet, a person, or a test case for how far reality can be stretched before fans stop accepting it? Here's where things get really interesting. Episodes that radically reframe them. Peter as a genius in Petarded, Stewie as a straight-up dramatist in Send in Stewie, Please, Brian as a genuine celebrity author or a dead, mourned family member, are often treated as huge turning points. Then the show quietly drops those changes, like someone hit undo on their character sheet. And when you watch Road to the Multiverse, or the various non-canon finales, you're not seeing wild one-offs. You're seeing extreme builds generated from the same underlying template. Nazi universe griffins, apocalyptic griffins, live-action griffins. They don't feel wrong. They feel disturbingly plausible, as if the show is browsing through a shared database of possible griffins and letting you peek at the ones that didn't become the default. What you're about to hear is that this isn't just sloppy writing. It's a pattern. The griffins behave like parameter sets, sliders dragged up and down by an unseen hand. Cruelty, intelligence, empathy, social status, sexuality, even mortality. Each episode is a new roll of the dice, but the dice don't remember, and the characters wake up in a new configuration with no memory of earlier selves. Only faint echoes in running gags, half-remembered traumas, and recurring abuses that feel both familiar and strangely disconnected. And you, watching from bed, accept it. As long as Peter is big and loud, Lois is red-haired and exasperated, Meg is suffering, Chris is dim, Stewie is dangerous, and Brian is talking, your brain files them as the same people, even when their inner lives contradict everything you've seen before. The show has taught you to prioritize the outline over the soul. This is going to get dark, because that's exactly how a system would treat digital characters, as recognizable silhouettes with endlessly editable interiors. So, I settle in with one last question before we move deeper. If the griffins are templates being re-rolled again and again, who designed those templates in the first place? And what does it gain from breaking and rebuilding this family forever? Creators as characters, characters as creators. The templates have designers, and Family Guy doesn't hide them as well as you'd think. Once you start looking at the episodes where the creators walk on stage, you realize the system occasionally lets you see the hands holding the puppets. On the surface, it plays as harmless ego. Seth MacFarlane voicing half the cast. The show mentioning his name, those smug little cutaways to the writers. But something happened as the series went on. Those jokes stopped being throwaway and started to look like coordinates. You get moments like Peter storming into the Fox building, or the cutaway to the Family Guy writer's room, where a group of bored staffers casually pitch the next scene you're about to watch. The joke is that the show is lazy. The feeling, if you're paying attention late at night, is that the walls are thinner than they should be. Characters complain about those walls constantly. Brian and Stewie grumble about the hack writers when a cutaway undercuts their emotional scene. Peter asks, "Who writes this stuff?" Right after surviving impossible violence, as if he knows there's a specific person deciding how broken his bones and his reality are allowed to be. Meg will look straight ahead after another round of abuse and deliver a line that sounds less like a character and more like an actor reading a note about the subject matter out loud. Who is she talking to? The audience, or the people hurting her on the page? Here's where things get really interesting. Sometimes the creators don't just get mentioned. They appear as functioning characters inside the narrative. We see a cutaway where the animators literally erase a background while Peter is standing in it. We get network executives cancelling and uncancelling the show from inside the episode, with the Griffins reacting to it like a weather report. In one gag, a writer instantly changes a scene after Peter complains, and the world around him updates like a glitched simulation. Decisions made in a fake boardroom immediately alter who lives, who dies, who stays married. Within the logic of this show, that makes the creators something more than external. They're in-universe gods who occasionally step down from the clouds. I complain about deadlines and then decide whether Quahog gets destroyed this week. You watch them. The Griffins, in their own limited way, watch them too. They name them, blame them, beg them. It's a disturbing symmetry, a feedback loop where the observers and the observed keep noticing each other, but can't quite make eye contact. What you're about to hear in the rest of this breakdown is going to get dark, because these aren't just vanity cameos. They're the system briefly showing you its operators, the way a dream occasionally lets you glimpse the person shaking you awake. So settle in with one more question that fans rarely want to stare at for too long. If the creators can step into the world they made, what happens if the world they made ever learns how to step out? Quahog versus the outside world, conflicting realities. If the creators can drift in and out of Quahog like lucid dreamers, the next question is obvious. What happens when the Griffins cross the town line? Because once you start looking at the episodes where they leave, you notice something deeply off. Reality doesn't just change locations, it changes rules. On the surface, Road to the Multiverse looks like a simple sci-fi adventure. Stewie and Brian slipping through alternate universes, each with its own art style, physics, and morality. Disney World, post-apocalyptic world, dog-dominant world. But something happened the moment they stepped out of baseline Quahog. The show quietly admitted there isn't one reality, just a cluster of incompatible ones, all orbiting that same Rhode Island town like unstable satellites. And think about their trips to other states and countries. In Road to Rhode Island, the world outside Quahog feels almost grounded. Airports, security, emotional family baggage. In Road to Europe, the Vatican, Germany, and England operate with their own internal logic, as if the violence and abuse back home has been dialed down to something recognizably human. Then you jump to Road to Germany, and suddenly time travel, Nazis, and paradoxes slide in effortlessly. Like the farther they get from Quahog, the more the universe tries to snap back into a coherent timeline and fails. Then there are the true border breaches. The Family Guy / The Simpsons guy crossover literally drags the Griffins into Springfield, a town with its own decades-old set of cartoon physics. You're watching characters compare rule sets in real time, and Homer and Peter's fight escalates into the kind of grotesque, bone-snapping violence that Springfield usually bends away from. The courtroom scene debates plagiarism, but underneath it, fans hear a different argument. Which reality is supposed to be the baseline, the slightly elastic world of The Simpsons, or the openly broken one that the Griffins bring with them. The Cleveland show crossover works the same way in reverse. When Cleveland comes back to Quahog, his tone shifts. His more grounded spin-off self dissolves into the louder, crueler ecosystem of Family Guy, as if the town's physics are contagious. Outsiders who visit Quahog don't just cameo, they glitch. They die in bigger explosions, endure harsher punchlines, or find their continuity quietly rewritten by the next episode. We're diving deep into a disturbing possibility here. Quahog isn't just a setting. It's a localized anomaly in a larger, slightly more consistent cartoon multiverse. Other cities, other shows, even other dimensions behave like they're following some kind of loose cosmic handbook. Quahog reads like the misprinted page. This is going to get dark, because what you're about to hear is that the town starts to resemble a narrative Bermuda Triangle, a place where timelines wander in, lose their memory, and never fully leave. And if there's a Bermuda Triangle, there's usually a map, or a control tower, or something worse. So settle in, because the next step is asking a question the show keeps almost answering. If Quahog is the anomaly, where is the lab, the control room, or the server rack quietly tracking every time its reality breaks? And the hidden lab? Is someone studying Quahog? So imagine that map exists, not on paper, not on a whiteboard in the writer's room, but in a place you never see on screen, a quiet, humming space where Quahog isn't a town, it's a file. On the surface, everything you've seen so far looks like disconnected chaos. Stewie's time machine erasing deaths, road to the multiverse, casually hopping realities, God and death showing up like mildly annoyed co-workers, live-action Peter walking into the cartoon, non-canon jokes bleeding into canon, entire apocalypses that vanish by next week. But something happened once you start looking at all of that together. It stops feeling like sloppy writing and starts feeling like system tests. Here's where things get really interesting. Imagine Quahog not as a naturally occurring universe, but as a constructed testbed, a controlled environment built to stress test narrative, morality, and consequence under pressure. Time travel arcs probe what happens when you rewind grief. Multiverse episodes measure how far you can distort characters before they stop being recognizable. Divine interventions check what people do when God is provably real but emotionally distant. Every continuity error becomes less of a mistake and more of a data point. In that framework, the cosmic beings we meet stop being just gags. God, death, even the devil function like different tiers of administrators, each with partial access to the system. Death can pause individual lives, but not the show. God can reboot the world, but still complains about network notes. The writers who appear on screen, and the cutaways where the characters argue with their own animators, those are higher-level admins, testing how much the simulation can notice its own boundaries before it breaks. And then there's Stewie. His inventions stop feeling like cartoon props and start reading as unauthorized access points. A baby who keeps building time machines, mind control devices, and portal guns is basically brute-forcing admin privileges the system never meant a character to have. Every time he rewinds Brian's death or slips into another dimension, you're watching a user exploit a backdoor. The cascading glitches, erased trauma, duplicated timelines, memories that don't quite line up, look disturbingly like a network trying to patch itself in real time. So, settle in, because what you're about to hear is the bedtime story version of that lab. Picture rows of monitors quietly logging every reset, every apocalypse, every instance of Meg's abuse played for a laugh. Some events are flagged as successful, others as discarded, some tagged with little markers that might as well say, "Bring this back if the ratings dip, because your behavior is in there too." When fans rage about Brian's death, when ratings spike after a darker, more violent episode, when online discourse dissects Stewie's psychology, that's all input. Timelines where the audience loses interest get abandoned. Timelines where the horror of consequence-free violence keeps people watching get resurrected. You're not just observing the experiment, you're steering it. And this is going to get dark because the next step isn't asking whether Quahog is being studied. It's asking a much worse question. What kind of experiment needs to keep breaking reality over and over just to see what the family does when nothing ever truly matters? The cutaway that never ends. When jokes outlive the timeline. So settle in, because if the experiment is about breaking reality, then the lab rats are running out of maze. And the first place you really see that isn't the main story at all. It's the cutaways. On the surface, those quick gags are supposed to be harmless. Peter says, "This is worse than the time I..." And you drop into a tiny sketch, then snap back to Quahog like nothing happened. But something happened. Over the years, those cutaways stopped behaving like disposable jokes and started acting like fully formed micro-universes, with their own continuity, their own characters, their own cause and effect. You notice it when the show revisits Conway Twitty, or the peanut butter jelly time banana, or the long, agonizing sequences of Peter fighting the giant chicken. These aren't one-off images. They grow. They remember. Here's where things get really interesting. Sometimes the cutaway doesn't stay in its box. The giant chicken starts as a non sequitur about an expired coupon and gradually becomes a recurring figure with a grudge, a home, a wife, property damage that spans cities. He leaks out of the joke space and into the main plot, dragging the episode with him for minutes at a time. What was supposed to be a throwaway bit now has more visible continuity than Meg's emotional life. That's not just comedy excess. That looks like an infection. Once you start looking at it that way, and the pacing of certain episodes becomes disturbing. Whole stories dissolve into a chain of cutaways, each one longer, more elaborate, more detached from whatever flimsy A-plot you were nominally watching. You feel it as a viewer. The main narrative begins to feel like the interruption. Quahog is the commercial break between cutaway dimensions. How many times have you forgotten what the episode was about because you got lost in a 5-minute gag about some alternate version of Peter dying horribly and then reappearing fine in the next scene? Fans use theories about multiverses and simulations to explain this. But inside the fiction, it suggests something else. A part of the show has learned that reality can be rewritten on command. Say the magic words, cut to a new world, do anything, kill anyone, and then abandon that universe when the punchline lands. No consequences, infinite tries. Isn't that exactly the power Stewie's time machine has, just cheaper and faster? And the more the writers lean on it, the more the cutaway realm starts to feel parasitic. It feeds on Quahog for context, then pulls attention, emotion, even continuity away from the family and into itself. The real world shrinks into a framing device for jokes that no longer need it. If the experiment is escalation, what happens when the cutaway dimension realizes it doesn't need the core timeline at all? Do the characters feel themselves thinning out between gags, scenes getting shorter, lives reduced to setups? Or will there be a moment where Quahog blinks, and when it opens its eyes, It's already inside the joke that never ends. When the show knows it's a show. Fourth walls that don't close again. And when it opens its eyes, it's already inside the joke that never ends. Because at a certain point, the show stops pretending there's even a barrier to protect it. The fourth wall isn't a wall anymore. It's a curtain the characters keep pulling back again and again, as if they're compulsively checking whether you're still there, still watching. On the surface, those moments read like simple meta-humor. Peter turning to camera to complain about those bastards at Fox. Stewie snapping, "We only have 11 minutes left," as if he can see the ad breaks closing in. Brian and Stewie arguing about cutaways as a writing device, or Peter announcing, "This is worse than the time." Like he's reading the episode outline with you, but something happened the first time a character did that. A line was crossed that can't really be uncrossed. Think about what it means if Peter knows he's on a network, if he can insult executives as though they're gods hovering just off screen. Once you start looking at those gags as moments of genuine awareness, the disturbing implication is that the realization wouldn't fully fade when the scene ends. It would linger, like a half-remembered nightmare. Would you ever be able to relax again if you'd once felt eyes on you from the dark, and then everyone insisted you were imagining it? The show keeps pushing it. There's the episode where the Griffins watch their own opening credits. The Times characters reference the exact length of the episode, or complain about filler scenes. The infamous gag where Stewie and Brian literally walk through the Fox lot and talk to the animators. Each joke pretends to reset afterward, but the universe has already heard itself described as a TV show. It can't unhear that. Here's where things get really interesting. If you string these fourth wall breaks together, they start to look less like isolated winks and more like a traumatized consciousness. A world that occasionally screams, "I'm fake, I'm controlled, I'm being watched," and then gets forced to act normal again. The characters go back to their abuse, their violence, their sitcom plots. But there's always that flicker where they look straight at you. How many times can a reality be told it isn't real before something inside it cracks? We're diving deep into the idea that these aren't just jokes. They're cumulative damage. And every time Peter negotiates with the network, or Stewie complains about the writers, the universe learns it can bargain with its creators. It can appeal, protest, even threaten. And once a world knows it can talk back, what stops it from eventually demanding a rewrite of fate itself? So settle in, because this is going to get dark. Those tiny throwaway asides might be the groundwork for the later, more extreme breaks we'll see. Deaths undone, timelines erased, whole universes swapped out like channels. And there's one character in particular who seems to remember these fractures a little too well, carrying that awareness from episode to episode while everyone else forgets. We'll talk about him soon. The script inside the script, when characters read their own lines. And this is where the nightmare stops being abstract and starts looking printed, literally. If those tiny memory glitches are the cracks, then the scripts are the blueprints showing through the wallpaper. What you're about to hear is where Family Guy stops just winking at you and starts letting its own characters touch the machinery. On the surface, a table read, "Gag feels harmless." You see Peter or Brian holding a stack of papers, complaining about a line, rolling their eyes at a joke that the writers forced on them. It plays as simple self-awareness, the show ribbing itself for lazy cutaways or edgy subject matter. But something happened once those scripts appeared inside the world. The moment a character can say, "Who wrote this?" They're not just breaking the fourth wall. They're acknowledging a document that exists both in our reality and theirs. Think about the episodes where the family gathers for an in-universe table read, or when Stewie flips through pages and reacts to upcoming scenes like spoilers for his own life. He isn't just aware he's on television. He's being handed the code to his next few minutes of existence. When Brian complains about his dialogue being out of character, or Peter blames the writers for making him do something cruel, that's not a throwaway joke. That's a character pointing directly at an unseen force of abuse and violence controlling their every impulse. Here's where things get really interesting. A fourth wall joke is a shout through the glass. A script, held in a character's hand, is a key. If Stewie can see that he's about to build a time machine, or Brian can see that he's about to die, what happens if they decide not to read the line the way it's written? Once you start looking at the later seasons through that lens, those bizarre tonal lurches and unexplained continuity glitches start to look less like writer fatigue and more like sabotage from inside the story. You watch Peter suddenly apologize with real sincerity, then snap back to monstrous indifference the next week. You see Meg briefly stand up for herself, almost escape her role as the family's punching bag, then get pulled back into ritualized humiliation. How many of those moments feel like someone tried to steer the scene away from its usual cruelty, only for the universe to violently correct itself? Theories suggest those are the takes where a character went off script and the reality of Quahog buckled for a second. So settle in, because this is going to get dark. If characters can read their own lines, they can also refuse them. Maybe that's why some episodes feel like fractured drafts layered on top of each other. Why Stewie's personality whiplashes. Why Brian's morality dissolves. You might be watching a war between writers and written, fought in tiny line readings and micro edits. And if Stewie or Brian ever got sustained access to a full script, not just a page or two, some fans think we've already seen test runs of that scenario disguised as special episodes. The next step is asking who, exactly, is winning. Broadcasters' afterlife. The TV in the TV that won't turn off. If the script is the weapon, the television is the altar. While Stewie and Brian fight over who gets to read the lines, there's something else humming in the background of almost every scene. That glowing rectangle in the Griffin living room that never really shuts up, never really goes away. On the surface, it looks like a basic sitcom prop. The family gathers to watch Channel 5 news. Tom Tucker delivers his smug headlines. Diane or Joyce chime in, and Quahog's disasters get repackaged as punchlines. But once you start looking at what they watch, it's disturbingly circular. Local commercials feature the same faces they know in real life. Fake sitcoms mirror their own dysfunction. Peter sees idiotic, violent man-children on TV and laughs, completely unaware he's watching a warped reflection of himself. Meg sees abused, humiliated nobodies, and quietly absorbs the message that this is just what a person like her is for. You're watching characters who are watching exaggerated versions of their own abuse and violence, sold back to them as entertainment, and they don't turn it off. Why would they, if that glow is the only hint there's a larger reality beyond their walls? Family Guy keeps pushing this further with those moments where the camera itself betrays them. Episodes will occasionally pull back to reveal the show as something being watched by other audiences. Peter and the family suddenly framed on a TV in a different living room, or the action snapping out to a studio taping, or a cutaway where an unseen viewer flips past their lives like a channel. These aren't just throwaway gags. They imply nested layers of viewership. Someone is always watching someone, The Griffins are an afterlife broadcast, and even that broadcast is just content for something else. Here's where things get really interesting. The TV in the Griffin house is almost always on. It's on during breakfast, on during arguments, on during moments that should be private or emotionally raw. It's not background noise, it's ritual, a shrine to the larger broadcast reality that owns them. The characters treat it like a window to a higher plane they can't fully perceive, a place where their suffering gets edited, scored, and scheduled between ads for Pawtucket Patriot and discount furniture. And every once in a while, that window glitches. They flip channels and land on something disturbingly self-referential. A cutaway to an episode of Family Guy. A joke about Fox executives debating their fate. A scene where their own theme song bleeds into the diegetic world. What you're about to hear is one of the darker theories fans use to explain this. Those moments aren't jokes gone too far. They're misrouted feeds. The simulation accidentally pipes in raw footage of their own prison. And for a second, Peter or Brian stares straight at the fact that they are the show. This is going to get dark, because some viewers think one specific recurring program isn't just noise at all, but a deliberate message from outside the system. And if you follow that signal, you might find the one channel that isn't meant for them, but for you. The day the world ended on a punchline. Apocalypses with reset buttons. And once you notice that outside signal, you start noticing something else. Inside Quahog, the world ends a lot. Not metaphorically, full extinction events. And then, everyone is back at the Drunken Clam like nothing happened. On the surface, these look like throwaway dark jokes. The nuclear blast at the end of Darboom, the global plague in fecal matters, Stewie accidentally destroying the universe in a time travel mishap, or those post-apocalyptic cutaways where Quahog is a fallout landscape of ash and twisted metal. You watch the sky turn white, the buildings melt, the characters vaporize. Hard cut. Next episode, same house, same couch, same TV. Fans usually explain this away as cartoon logic, but something happened when you stack them together. You get nuclear annihilation, magical transformations, global mutations, and timelines where humanity never recovers, all treated as disposable punchlines. No reconstruction arc, no generational trauma. No one even mentions that technically, they've already lived through the end of days. Here's where things get really interesting. A disturbing number of these apocalypses are either caused or fixed by Stewie. His time machine doesn't just rewind a scene. It canonically erases deaths, rewrites relationships, and restores entire timelines like you're loading an old save file. The show tells you directly that reality can be rolled back, that consequences can be scrubbed, that the universe itself has an undo button. So settle in, because what you're about to hear is that this isn't just a gag. It starts to feel like procedure, a bureaucratic process for annihilation. Stewie triggers an event, or some cosmic force like death or God allows it to happen. The episode rides the horror for a few minutes, and then some unseen system quietly reinstalls the previous version of Quahog. No paperwork, no grieving, just a clean reset. But each reset leaves residue. Continuity errors that never quite line up. Characters acting like they've met before in timelines where they technically haven't. Peter having déjà vu about disasters that never happened. Brian occasionally staring a little too long at the camera when someone mentions dying. Once you start looking at these moments, they feel less like sloppy writing and more like trauma bleed through from lives they don't remember living. This is going to get dark, and because it raises a question you're not meant to ask. How many times has the world ended between episodes? How many unseen Mondays begin after another apocalypse was quietly rolled back on Sunday night? Every cold open could be the first day after untold deaths, with the family's memories wiped, but their nervous systems still buzzing. We're diving deep into a reality where annihilation has become routine maintenance, where the universe crashes, reboots, and pretends nothing happened. And if the apocalypses are just the big resets, what smaller, more personal erasures have been quietly patched over in these characters' lives without them ever knowing? The multiverse episode that said too much. And once you start looking at those quiet erasures, you can't really avoid the next step. The moments where the show stops resetting the universe and just walks into another one. On the surface, Road to the Multiverse is a flashy gimmick episode. Stewie and Brian build a gizmo, press a button, and suddenly they're sliding through realities like channels on a TV. But something happened in that episode that most fans treat as a fun experiment, when it actually reads like a confession. Quahog is only one node in a vast, unstable network of universes, and the show knows exactly how fragile that makes everything you've been watching. Structurally, it's disturbingly clean. Stewie and Brian hop from a Disney universe to a live-action universe to a post-apocalyptic one, each with its own rules, physics, and history already in place, as if they've always existed. And there's no loading screen, no creation moment, just fully formed realities waiting to be visited. What you're about to hear isn't just cartoon variety. It's the implication that every stylistic shift you've ever seen on the show might be a neighboring universe bleeding through. Here's where things get really interesting. The horror is almost always in the background. You're shown worlds where the Griffins are dead, mutated, or unrecognizable, and the script treats them like throwaway gags. A universe where humanity is enslaved. A universe frozen in a religious dictatorship. A universe where the apocalypse already happened and never got undone. These aren't dreams. These are stable timelines where alternate Griffins are suffering in parallel, and the camera just keeps moving. So, settle in, because this is going to get dark. Once a path between universes is opened, the episode never convincingly closes it. The device is smashed, or lost, or turned off. But Stewie has the blueprints. Brian has the memories. The audience has proof. In multiverse theories, that's all you really need for long-term leakage. Logic slipping, physics bending, personalities drifting, as if the show occasionally forgets which version of a character it's writing. Why does Brian's morality spike and crash between episodes? Why does Peter's violence escalate in one season, then plateau in the next, as if he's been swapped with a slightly different Peter? Fans use this to explain later unexplained changes, different visual palettes, shifts in Meg's design, entire backstories quietly rewritten. Maybe those aren't retcons. Maybe Stewie and Brian simply never found their way home after one of these trips, and the show just kept going in whatever universe they landed in. If that's true, then the original Family Guy you remember from the early seasons might be sitting in another branch of reality, abandoned. Its version of the family frozen at the moment the narrative camera left. And the most disturbing part? No one on screen ever notices, but you do. Because once you start looking at the show through that lens, you have to ask, when exactly did we lose the real Quahog? And how many universe jumps ago did the writers quietly stop telling us which timeline we were in? When two Griffins meet, duplicates, clones, and identity drift. And if you can lose track of which universe you're in, there's an even more unsettling question waiting for you in the dark. Are you still looking at the same Griffins? Or just the latest batch? On the surface, Family Guy treats clones and duplicates as throwaway gags. Stewie mass produces himself in The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair, casually printing imperfect copies that melt, glitch, and beg. There's the evil Stewie from The Big Bang Theory, the alternate Peters from Road to the Multiverse, the extra Brians from Back to the Pilot, and the Stewie who grows a deformed twin in Chitty Chitty Death Bang. The show doesn't hesitate. It spawns new versions of its main characters, uses them for a few minutes of dark humor, then discards them like defective merch. What you're about to hear is where things stop feeling like simple cartoon logic and start sounding like identity horror. Once you start looking at how everyone else reacts to these copies, you notice something strange. The Griffins barely question it. Lois tolerates whole armies of Stewies. Peter's alternate selves are accepted, merged into the joke, then forgotten. Brian literally meets another Brian and treats him as a curiosity, not an existential threat. Shouldn't someone be asking which one is real, which one the family is actually bonded to? Instead, the fabric of identity stretches until it's almost meaningless. If anyone can be printed, reprinted, and overwritten, then Peter isn't a person. He's a role the universe keeps filling. And this is going to get dark because some of those copies know it. The defective Stewie clones sob and plead as they're culled. Evil Stewie fights for survival before being erased. In the alternate, Brians and Peters show distinct personalities and desires, then vanish between episodes, as if the narrative itself executed them off screen. We're diving deep into a version of the show where the worst form of abuse isn't just physical violence, but the quiet knowledge that you are replaceable. Imagine being a clone in Quahog and understanding that the main version of you will get the house, the family, the continuity, and you'll get the cutaway. How many of those dying duplicates believed for a second that they might be the one who gets to stay? Here's where things get really interesting. Over time, Peter becomes more monstrous, Lois more complicit, Stewie more fractured, Brian more hypocritical. Fans usually explain this as flanderization, lazy writing, or a shift in the subject matter after the revival. But what if those personality shifts are evidence of quiet swaps? A Peter who survived one chicken fight is replaced by a Peter who didn't. A Stewie who built one time machine is overwritten by a Stewie from a timeline where he failed. You're meant to believe there's a continuous main family. But something happened. The clones, alternates, and replacements stacked up until there was no clear original left. Just an unbroken performance of being the Griffins. And if that's true, then the next question is even worse. Who or what is doing the casting? Brian's death, and the glitch that wouldn't stay fixed, and that casting experiment reaches its most public failure with Brian. Because this time, the show didn't just swap a background extra, it tried to replace a lead. On the surface, My Life of Brian plays like a straightforward tragedy. Brian is hit by a car. There are no cutaways, no undercutting gag, no last-minute time machine save. You watch the family gather around his hospital bed, hear the machines, see Stewie's face collapse. They hold a funeral. They get a new dog, Vinny. The subject matter is played straight, as if the show is finally saying, this death counts. For a moment, it feels permanent. The marketing leaned into it. The writers gave interviews insisting Brian was gone. Fans were told to move on, to accept this as the new reality. And for a couple of episodes, you're watching a different configuration of the family, a replacement slotted into a role that used to belong to a character who'd been there since the pilot. It's unsettling in a way the violence never is, because it's quiet. But something happened. The backlash was immediate and intense. Petitions, angry posts, ratings panic. Outside the show, the larger system flinched. Inside the show, Stewie suddenly finds his destroyed time machine, reconstructs it with absurd ease, and pulls a Brian from just before the accident. No paradox, no lasting scar, just a clean rollback. Vinny gives a little goodbye. The family cries with relief, and the universe snaps back like nothing ever broke. Here's where things get really interesting. That speed and neatness feels less like organic storytelling and more like an emergency patch. As if forces above the characters, network executives, writers, the audience itself, reached down and said, "No, that rewrite of reality doesn't stick." Have you noticed how the episode treats time travel like a customer support tool and not a dangerous machine? Press undo, restore previous save, pretend the glitch never happened. Except it did. And once you start looking at Brian before and after, the differences start to feel disturbing. Earlier, Brian is smug, self-righteous, but still emotionally invested in the family, still occasionally idealistic. Post-resurrection, Brian leans harder into detached cynicism, cruelty dressed as honesty, a dull awareness that nothing really matters. Is that just the show getting darker? Or are you watching a copy trying to perform a life it never actually lived? Some fan theories argue the original Brian stays dead on that street, and the new Brian is from a neighboring branch of the timeline, dragged in to plug the hole. That would explain why his tone shifts, why his writing grows more nihilistic, why he seems tired in a way that doesn't match his age. Imagine waking up in a world where everyone remembers events you never experienced, yet expects you to act like you did. How long before you start to break? In that sense, Brian's death arc becomes a public stress test of the show's reality. How far can Family Guy push a permanent change before the meta-reality slams the door? The answer apparently is not that far. Major cast members can't stay dead, only overwritten. And if Brian really is a replacement, there's an even worse implication. He's the one character most attuned to the show's shifting logic, the one who talks about writing, art, and meaning. What you're about to hear is a theory that Brian, more than anyone else in Quahog, might remember both timelines, the one where he died and the one where he didn't. If that double exposure to reality is eating at him, it would explain his growing bitterness, his self-destruction, his constant need to comment on the show itself. So settle in, because this is going to get dark. We're diving deep into what it means to be conscious in a world that keeps rebooting around you, and what happens when one character finally starts to notice. Meg as a glitch. The character the universe refuses to render correctly. And what happens when one character finally starts to notice? Because Brian isn't the only one the universe keeps rewriting. If he's the commentator, Meg is the glitch. On the surface, she looks like just another punching bag character in a mean-spirited cartoon. But once you start looking at how unstable Meg is across the life of the show, it stops feeling like a running joke and starts feeling like a rendering error that never quite resolved. Early on, Meg was almost normal. In season 1, voiced by Lacey Chabert, she's shy, insecure, but recognizably a teenage girl trying to fit in. The abuse is there, but it's muted, grounded in sitcom awkwardness rather than ritual humiliation. Then the voice changes. The animation tightens. The show comes back from cancellation. And something happened. The post-revival Meg, now with Mila Kunis's harsher, flatter delivery, isn't just ignored. She's systematically dismantled, as if the universe keeps deleting pieces of her to see if that fixes the file. We're diving deep into those little continuity fractures the show pretends are jokes. Characters forget who she is mid-conversation, and Peter calls her Megatron, Megan, or just it. Like the system can't pull the right string from the database. There are episodes where Lois has to be reminded she has a daughter, where the family stares through Meg as if she's transparent. You're watching a main character treated as an optional asset, a texture that sometimes fails to load. Here's where things get really interesting. The show itself keeps losing track of basic facts about her. Her age drifts, her backstory shifts. 1 week, she's a failed popular girl. The next, she's a complete social non-entity. Then suddenly she's competent enough to run the household during a crisis. These aren't just lazy writers. They read like a simulation trying different parameter settings and never saving properly. How many times can a person be reconfigured before they stop feeling real, even to the people around them? The dark twist is that Meg occasionally acts like she knows. Those rare outbursts, where she turns on the family during the cabin episode, or when she calmly absorbs their hatred and then weaponizes it back at them, feel less like standard teen angst and more like a trapped process spiking the CPU. You can almost hear the system fans whirring when she stops playing along. What happens if that process doesn't crash next time? Some theories say Meg's endless abuse and escalating degradation aren't just edgy subject matter, but a symptom of the universe failing to integrate her. The world of Family Guy can't decide what she is: victim, background extra, moral compass, or glitch. So it keeps corrupting her data. I'm stripping her down to thing bad stuff happens to, because that's the only version that doesn't destabilize the episode. And what you're about to hear in the next part is even more unsettling. If Meg is a glitch, what happens if she ever syncs with every overwritten version of herself and remembers all of them at once? Lois and the Elastic Past. Retconned histories as timequake scars. If Meg is a glitch, Lois is something worse. She's the error log. On the surface, Lois Griffin looks stable. Same voice, same outfit, same role as the weary mother trying to keep this violent cartoon family from flying apart. But once you start looking at her past, you notice something disturbing. It doesn't exist as one story. It exists as overlapping, incompatible drafts, all being treated as equally real. We're diving deep into those drafts. In one episode, Lois is the privileged daughter of billionaire Carter Pewterschmidt, raised in obscene wealth, practically royalty. In another, she's suddenly from a modest background, teaching piano lessons to pay the bills. Sometimes she met Peter when he was a towel boy at the country club. Other times, they lock eyes at a faux concert, or she's already engaged to someone else and Peter crashes in. Which one is true? The show never chooses. It just stacks them. Her early jobs fracture the same way. You've seen Lois as a piano teacher, a model, a small-time criminal, a star of a one-hit wonder band, even a former meth addict who casually slips back into addiction. These aren't framed as what-if scenarios or fantasies. The subject matter is presented as canon every time, with no attempt to explain why her life path keeps rewriting itself around the same present-day Lois, who still makes dinner in that same Quahog kitchen. Here's where things get really interesting. Most sitcoms hit the reset button, but they pretend there's one underlying history. Family Guy doesn't bother. It behaves like Stewie's time machine has quietly detonated Lois's personal timeline over and over, leaving narrative scar tissue. Each new origin, each new career, each new revelation about her pre-marriage life feels like a shard from a different universe that never got properly deleted, so it just overlays the old one. What you're about to hear is less continuity nitpick and more psychological horror. Imagine being Lois. Every version of her remembers loving Peter, hating Peter, cheating on Peter, almost leaving Peter. And yet all those mutually exclusive lives feel equally real. How do you process a childhood that was both sheltered billionaire luxury and struggling music teacher poverty? How do you carry memories of being a bored housewife and a thrill-seeking criminal at the same time? You don't. You crack. And Lois does crack. Her sudden bursts of violence, her gambling addiction, her affair teases, her whiplash personality shifts from nurturing to sadistic, all start to look like pressure leaks. You're not just watching abuse jokes, you're watching stacked histories bleeding through a single nervous system. One Lois is horrified by the family's violence. Another Lois enjoys it. Another is numb. When the timelines misalign, you see her snap at Meg without reason, or go from moral voice to active participant in the cruelty in a single cut. This is going to get dark, because once you treat Lois as a living timequake scar, a new question appears. What if she's the key to counting how many times the timeline has been rewritten, simply because her backstory changes more visibly than anyone else's? And what happens if she ever remembers every version at once? Stewie's time machine as a failing life support system. And what happens if she ever remembers every version at once? To answer that, you have to look at the only thing in the Griffin house that openly admits reality can be edited, Stewie's time machine. On the surface, it's played as a fun sci-fi toy, a convenient excuse for road trips, Hitler jokes, and paradox gags. But once you start looking at when it's actually used, and the pattern feels less playful and more like watching a failing life support system, trying to keep a dying patient alive. Think about the big ones you remember. In Road to the Multiverse, the machine doesn't just hop dimensions. It shows you entire universes frozen in permanent apocalypse, as if failed timelines are stored like organs on ice. In The Big Bang Theory, Stewie and Brian chase Bertram through time to prevent Stewie from being erased, literally fighting to keep this version of reality breathing. Then there's Life of Brian, where Brian dies, the family grieves, the show commits. And only after backlash does Stewie dig through the wreckage of time to drag a different Brian in from another branch. Fans say it fixed things. The darker reading is that we watched a transplant. Here's where things get really interesting. The machine breaks. A lot. Early on is precise, almost smug. Later seasons show it misfiring, overshooting, dumping them in wrong eras, or refusing to start without obscure parts Stewie suddenly remembers he needs. In Stu and Stewie's Excellent Adventure, future tech contradicts other futures. In later Road to episodes, the controls glitch, universes blur, and the device feels less like a clean instrument and more like a ventilator alarm that never quite shuts off. Each reset seems to make the next one harder, as if the timeline itself is developing scar tissue. So settle in, because what you're about to hear shifts Stewie from child genius to something much more disturbing. Theories suggest he isn't really the architect. He's the kid who found the control panel in a collapsing building and taught himself which buttons stopped the screaming for a few more minutes. The show hints that something older built the framework, cosmic beings like Death and God, the writers who literally appear on screen, even the multiverse lattice from Road to the Multiverse that already exists before Stewie starts poking at it. He's less an inventor and more an unwitting technician, maintaining a system he barely understands. And if that's true, then this is going to get dark, because every malfunction is a warning. One day, the machine won't boot, or it will send them back, but nothing will be there to go back to. What does a Family Guy episode look like when Brian dies and there is no other Brian to steal? When Lois remembers every version of her life and there's no reset button to wipe the overlap? When Peter destroys the world in a cutaway and the next scene doesn't cut back? The final, irreversible break in reality wouldn't be an explosion. It would be silence. An episode where something goes wrong. Stewie sprints to the basement, slams the switch, and for the first time, the universe realizes there are no more backups left to load. The episodes that admit it's all a dream, and then don't wake up. And if there are no more backups, what happens when an episode itself tries to pretend it never existed? On the surface, the "it was all a dream" structure is supposed to be the safest possible reset button. The show tells you, very gently, that none of what you just watched was real, that the violence, the abuse, and the betrayals were just a fantasy. Family Guy leans on that structure a lot. You get straight-up dream episodes like Stewie's Therapy Deep Dive, fantasy specials like Blue Harvest, and alternate timeline experiments where Brian and Stewie slide into futures that are explicitly labeled non-canon. But something happened once the writers realized they could announce, "This doesn't count," and still keep the pieces they liked. You see it in the Star Wars parodies first. Officially, they're just Peter telling a story. Quahog is safe in the framing device. And yet, visual tricks, camera moves, even specific jokes and character beats migrate back into regular episodes, as if the show's reality has been lightly contaminated by its own fan fiction. Once you start looking at it that way, those specials feel less like throwaways and more like test runs. Here's where things get really interesting. In theory, these dream realities are containment zones. The writers can crank the subject matter darker, push the violence further, rewrite characters completely, then close the lid by having someone wake up or shrug or say, "None of that actually happened." But elements keep bleeding through. A crueler version of Peter from a fantasy sequence quietly becomes the default Peter. Future Stewie's bitterness appears in present-day Stewie's throwaway lines. Whole plot lines, first introduced as hypothetical what-if scenarios, later re-emerge as canon without comment. So, settle in, because what you're about to hear is that the dream label might be less of a reset and more of a lab coat. These episodes are dangerous experiments where the show tests how far it can fracture reality, morality, and continuity before fans stop accepting Quahog as a coherent world. And the disturbing part is that fans didn't stop. They adapted, they laughed, they explained it away as parody or meta-humor, even as the borders between dream and waking life inside the show started to dissolve. Think about the episodes that end with a character jolting awake, sweating, insisting it was all just a nightmare. The camera pulls back. The music softens. You're supposed to feel relief. But what if the cut back to normal Quahog is still inside that dream? What if one of those endings, the ones everyone forgets because the show never references them again, was the moment the universe failed to wake up? In the next section, we're diving deep into the possibility that Family Guy only thinks it left that dream. and that everything since has been the fallout of never opening its eyes. Continuity as a haunted house, the jokes that remember you. If the show never really woke up, then what you're about to hear is what it feels like to live inside the dream's house. Not a cozy sitcom home, but a place where every wall remembers something the writers tried to forget. On the surface, Quahog looks stable. Same house, same bar, same talking dog. But something happened over the years. The continuity stopped behaving like a timeline and started behaving like a haunting. Characters and gags don't just come back for nostalgia. They reappear like spirits replaying the same unfinished business. One season, Mort Goldman vanishes into the background, barely there. Years later, he drifts back in with the exact same anxieties, the same punchlines, as if no time has passed for him at all. You've moved on. The show hasn't. Family Guy's full of these ghosts. The evil monkey in Chris's closet disappears for long stretches, then materializes again, still pointing, still trapped in the same gesture, like a looped apparition. The giant chicken should have died in one of those apocalyptic fights, but instead it keeps returning. The injuries bigger, the destruction worse, the silence afterward more disturbing. Each rematch remembers the last one. The choreography escalates, the callbacks stack, the violence becomes a ritual. At what point does a running joke stop being funny and start feeling like a curse the show can't shake? Here's where things get really interesting. Some of these patterns act like they're self-aware. The Conway Twitty cutaways, the endless, you think that's bad stories. The way Peter or Brian will sigh and acknowledge, out loud, that they've done this bit before. Once you start looking at it, the repetition isn't lazy. It's textual. It's the house whispering, we've been here already. You're watching a show that knows it's stuck replaying its own trauma, but keeps hitting the same marks anyway. Think of Quahog's continuity as a house with too many renovations. Early seasons built one version of reality. Lois's backstory, Brian's ideals, Stewie's murderous focus. Then, new seasons knocked through those walls, retconned relationships, sealed off entire rooms of canon. Meg's brief moments of genuine connection get plastered over by more elaborate abuse. Brian's moral crises get buried under layers of smug hypocrisy. The foundations are still there, but now they're under floorboards of newer, darker subject matter. And lately, that buried structure is starting to push back. Old plot lines the show ignored for a decade suddenly get named, mocked, half apologized for. Characters mention Brian's death, Stewie's time travel, Meg's lifelong mistreatment, as if the house is forcing them to acknowledge the stains on the carpet. Have you noticed how the Meg abuse jokes have become more self-referential, more bitter, like the show is arguing with its own past cruelty? That running gag feels less like a bit and more like something knocking from inside the walls, demanding to be recognized. So settle in, because this is going to get dark. If the continuity is haunted, then someone or something has to be doing the haunting. In the next section, we're diving deep into who might actually be rearranging the rooms, resetting the clocks, and deciding which ghosts get to walk the halls again. Quahog as a nexus point. Why everything weird happens here. If the continuity is haunted, then Quahog is the house. The walls, the floorboards, the locked attic no one talks about. You think you're just watching a small Rhode Island town, but something happened along the way. This place turned into a nexus, a crossroads where every broken rule of reality quietly meets. On the surface, Quahog looks painfully ordinary. A bar, a pharmacy, a school, a TV station. But once you start looking at what actually happens there, the pattern gets disturbing. And Death doesn't just visit. He hangs out, flirts, complains about his job, and keeps coming back to the same streets. God shows up in bars, in hospitals, on dates with human women, and somehow always within driving distance of Spooner Street. Aliens abduct people from Quahog, not New York, not Washington, not the Vatican. Why here? Think about the sheer variety of impossible events that seem magnetized to this one town. Stewie's time machine is built in a suburban bedroom, yet its resets affect the entire planet. Brian dies in the street outside the Griffin house, and reality itself rewinds from that intersection. The giant chicken fights level half the city with apocalyptic violence, and the damage evaporates by next week. Multiverse travel in Road to the Multiverse doesn't start from some high-tech lab. It starts from a toddler and his dog walking through Quahog. Here's where things get really interesting. The show keeps dropping hints that Quahog isn't just a setting. It's a structural weak point, a cosmic fault line. You get episodes where the world literally ends. Nuclear war, global plagues, humanity wiped out. And then the next episode calmly returns to the same town layout, the same houses, as if the universe reloaded from a save file stored under Rhode Island. Fans use these theories to explain why so many reality glitches, continuity breaks, and erased timelines all seem to anchor back to this place. Visiting entities treat Quahog like a known coordinate on a much bigger map. Death knows the Griffins by name. God recognizes Peter, not as a one-off joke, but with the weary familiarity of someone who's fixed this mess before. And time travelers, future Stewies, alternate versions of the family, even cosmic-level beings all act like Quahog is a regular stop on their route. They arrive, meddle with reality, then leave with the same detached attitude you'd have walking out of a mall you don't actually live near. And yet visually, Quahog never changes. That's the camouflage. A bland, looping suburb hiding the machinery that holds multiple unstable realities together. What you're about to hear in the next sections is built on this idea. If Quahog is the central node, then every cutaway, every reset, every act of casual abuse and violence is stress on the system. We're diving deep into what happens if that nexus finally fails, and what that would mean, not just for this family, but for every connected universe the show has ever hinted at. The laugh track you can't hear. Audience as a cosmic pressure. If Quahog is the central node, then there has to be something pressing on it, squeezing it, demanding more. So settle in, because what you're about to hear is that the real pressure isn't God, or death, or Stewie's inventions. It's you. It's the audience. On the surface, Family Guy treats ratings, cancellations, and renewals like throwaway industry jokes. Peter complains about Fox executives like they're annoying neighbors. Characters mention getting cancelled again, the way normal people talk about a snowstorm coming. But something happened over time. These references stopped feeling like commentary and started sounding like weather reports inside the universe. A low-pressure system of bad ratings moves in, and suddenly, the Griffin family's reality is threatened with erasure. Think about the way the show talks about its own survival. In one episode, Peter literally thanks DVD sales for bringing them back, as if some invisible climate event resurrected the town. In others, characters brace for cancellation like it's a natural disaster siren. If the numbers drop, the world ends. Theories take this seriously. To the characters, audience metrics aren't abstract. They're tectonic forces. Syndication is a second sun. Network nodes are earthquakes. Here's where things get really interesting. Once you start looking at jokes as stress tests, the entire reality shifts. A gag that lands with fans, that gets quoted, clipped, replayed, becomes strangely permanent. The Conway Twitty cutaways, the chicken fights, and Meg's relentless abuse and humiliation, these bits keep returning, mutating, integrating deeper into the family's lives. They become more real because they generated a strong enough reaction to stabilize their timeline. Meanwhile, the things that don't hit, the forgotten side characters, abandoned plot lines, one-off serious moments that never get mentioned again, they slide into a kind of non-canon limbo. They happened, but only in a branch that didn't earn enough attention to survive. In this theory, continuity isn't about what the writers remember. It's about what the audience rewarded. This is going to get dark, because that means the physics of Quahog are based on the entertainment value. Suffering that makes people laugh is prolonged. Abuse that pulls ratings gets intensified. Violence that shocks just enough to trend becomes structurally important. When Brian's death triggered outrage, reality itself bent backward to undo it. But notice what didn't get undone. The idea that his death could be used that way. The universe learned that emotional manipulation works, so it became part of the rulebook. Imagine living in a world where your injuries only heal if they're not funny anymore, where your trauma resets the moment the punchline stops landing, where your deepest pain might be rewound and replayed, not because of fate or morality, but because millions of unseen eyes found it engaging. That's the real horror of this subject matter. The Griffins exist in a feedback loop, where fan response writes the laws of reality. In that sense, the audience's gaze becomes the ultimate meta-entity. Not Stewie, not God, not the network, us. The more we watch, the more the show contorts itself, escalating cruelty, bending time, breaking its own logic just to keep you from changing the channel. And if that pressure keeps increasing, you have to wonder, what happens when the audience finally looks away, or demands something the universe can't safely provide? Threading the fractures, quietly mapping every broken rule. So settle in for a moment and pull back with me. We've been zoomed in on individual fractures, single jokes, single episodes, single horrifying little slips in logic. But once you start looking at all of them at once, the picture changes. It stops feeling like chaos and starts feeling like architecture. On the surface, each pillar of broken reality can be explained away. The meta-reality breaks, the cutaways, the fourth wall ruptures, the scenes where Peter complains about the writers. You're told those are just the show being clever. Time travel and timeline resets. That's just Stewie's time machine giving the family a do-over. Peter bargaining with death, or chatting with God in a bar, that's just edgy religious humor. Simulations, alternate dimensions, entire universes wiped out and then quietly restored before the next episode. Cartoon logic. Move along. But something happened as we walked through them slowly. You saw Stewie rewrite history to undo Brian's death, not once, but as a pattern. Reality bends, grief is erased, and everyone carries on as if the first version of events never existed. You watched Peter die, negotiate with death, and stroll back into the living room like he just ran an errand. You saw episodes where the show openly acknowledges its own script, its own network, even its own cancellation, as if Quahog is sitting on a stage built on top of another stage. Individually, you can shrug. Together, they form a lattice, a consistent, repeatable way that the show treats rules as negotiable, memory as optional, and mortality as a setting you can toggle. This doesn't behave like a handful of disconnected gags. It behaves like a system where entire timelines get discarded with no emotional residue, where an apocalypse can end an episode and the next week the same characters are back at the Drunken Clam, nursing beers like nothing happened. If this family felt anything, where did it go? Here's where things get really interesting. The tone of the show knows when it's breaking something important. Listen to the way the music drops out right before Stewie pulls the lever on the time machine. Watch how the pacing slows when Peter meets death, how the jokes thin out and the dialogue suddenly breathes. Think about those moments when Brian or Stewie stare just a little too long at the camera or into empty space, as if they're hearing a noise from outside the set. The subject matter turns dark, and the soundscape politely steps aside to let you feel it. These breaks don't scatter evenly either. They cluster around certain characters, Stewie, Brian, Peter, and certain spaces. The Griffin living room, the Drunken Clam, that blank white cutaway void where anything can happen and nothing has to count. Fans notice that when reality shatters, it's usually in their orbit, and as if they're standing on recurring fault lines while everyone else just walks over solid ground. What you're about to hear is that if you plotted every violation of reality on a timeline, you wouldn't see static noise. You'd see escalation. Early, playful cutaways grow into full multiverse tours. One-off deaths become sincere, weaponized tragedies reversed by cosmic cheats. The show keeps probing. How far can it twist this universe before you stop accepting it as just a joke? We haven't just been cataloguing gags. We've been assembling a stress map of Quahog's reality. Every seam, every tear, every point where the fabric gives way. And this is going to get dark, because the next step isn't more examples. It's a reinterpretation. We're diving deep into the idea that there is a specific kind of universe that would allow, and maybe even require, all of these fractures to exist at once. The question isn't, why is Family Guy like this anymore? It's, what kind of reality are these characters trapped in? And who, or what, keeps turning the screws? The observer theory. When the audience becomes the monster. So settle in, because if you follow that question all the way down, you end up somewhere very uncomfortable. The idea that the real monster in Family Guy isn't Stewie or Peter or even the writers. It's you watching them. It's all of us. On the surface, fourth wall breaks look like cheap gags. Peter staring at the camera, Stewie addressing the viewers at home, Brian sighing directly to you after another failed attempt at being moral in a world that clearly isn't. But something happened when those moments started piling up, and they stopped feeling like throwaway jokes and start reading like survival behaviors. Like the characters have learned that acknowledging the gaze gives them a tiny bit of leverage over a reality that keeps rewriting itself. If you knew you were being observed by something you couldn't see or understand, wouldn't you start talking to it too? Here's where things get really interesting. Whenever the show jokes about ratings, cancellations, or network notes, it's not just industry satire. It's the universe admitting that its physics are audience dependent. The infamous cancellation and 2005 revival aren't just behind the scenes trivia. In universe, they're mass extinction and resurrection events triggered by external attention. The characters literally reference being cancelled and it then coming back because enough people bought DVDs and watched reruns. That means the number of eyes on Quahog decides whether its sun rises tomorrow. Think about the episodes that lean into this, the ones that mention the shift in animation style, or the time they openly talk about being edgier now. those aren't harmless production notes. Those are moments where the universe remembers dying, remembers dissolving into static, and then waking up again in a slightly different body because fans demanded it. Theories that this marks a jump from a softer universe alpha to a crueler universe beta suddenly feel less abstract and more like a trauma response. In physics, there's the observer effect, the idea that measuring something, watching it, changes how it behaves. What you're about to hear is that same principle. I dragged into a cartoon town. Once you start looking at Family Guy through that lens, the pattern sharpens. The more self-aware the show becomes, the more violently reality warps. Time travel resets, erased deaths, whole apocalyptic endings that are quietly overwritten by the next episode. Each one plays like the universe glitching under the pressure of being constantly measured by millions of viewers. And then there's the cutaway dimension, the purest expression of observer-powered reality. These scenes don't exist until someone wonders, remember that time? Our curiosity is the switch. For a few seconds, a fully formed mini-world flickers into existence, Peter in a war zone, Meg in some new humiliating scenario, Stewie committing elaborate violence, and then it dissolves the instant our attention moves on, and they're like subatomic events, summoned by the question, annihilated by boredom. Listen to how the characters talk when the subject matter gets bleak. Brian pleading with you to be reasonable about politics or ethics. Meg breaking down and asking why everyone hates her. Stewie monologuing about futility, about nothing ever changing. On one level, it's just dark comedy about abuse and despair. But underneath, it feels like they're trying to negotiate with the thing that keeps resetting their world, begging the observer to want something different so the rules will finally shift. The disturbing implication is that Quahog isn't just a fictional town. It's a habitat designed to be watched, a terrarium that only stays coherent as long as we keep staring at it. Every cancellation scare, every ratings joke, and every meta comment about needing to be shocking this week becomes a reminder that attention is oxygen. No viewers, no reality. The violence escalates because we didn't change the channel when it was mild. And if observation is the real God here, then every rewatch, every meme, every time you let another episode autoplay is a kind of prayer, a quiet signal that you still want this reality to exist. The characters can't name what we are, but they can feel the pressure of that invisible audience. They feel it when the world ends and then doesn't. They feel it when Brian dies and comes back because the outcry was loud enough. They feel it in every lingering glance at the camera, like animals who realize the glass of the enclosure only looks solid until the hands on the other side decide they're bored. And once you accept that, you have to ask yourself a darker question. If our gaze is what keeps them trapped in this endlessly rebooting loop, what exactly are we doing every time we press play? The simulation spiral. If Quahog is a test, who's failing? So settle in, because if your attention is the glass of the enclosure, then what you're about to hear is what's hiding on the other side of it. On the surface, Family Guy looks like a messy writer's room, throwing out whatever gag will get a reaction. But once you start looking at the way reality breaks, it feels less like chaos and more like a controlled experiment. You get dream reveals where whole plots are dismissed in a line. You get cutaways to the actual writer's room, where the characters watch themselves being written. You get godlike beings literally editing events, and sudden shifts in animation style that feel less like artistic flair and more like swapping out the rendering engine on a simulation mid-run. Why keep showing you the code, unless the code is the point? Here's where things get really interesting. Stewie's time machine, the multiverse remote, all those impossible devices fans use to explain continuity. What if they're not inventions at all, but interfaces, debug tools, developer consoles accidentally left in the hands of a violent toddler? When Stewie erases Brian's death, or undoes apocalypses we've already watched play out, he's not changing the past. He's rolling back to a previous save state. He's stress testing how much loss, how much violence, how much abuse a fictional family can endure before the system has to quietly restore from backup. And above that, you have the admin accounts. Death shows up and pauses people mid-sentence. God rewinds time to watch a moment again. Cosmic figures bend reality, but they still complain about rules, quotas, bureaucracy they didn't design. They're like mid-level moderators in a hierarchy you never fully see. They can kill Peter, reset him, drag him through afterlives that look suspiciously like TV sets. But they can't stop the show. Those infamous continuity errors start to look different through this lens. Characters die in one episode, stroll back in another. Backstories mutate. Events are remembered differently depending on who's talking and which season you're in. It feels less like lazy writing and more like version control conflicts. Branches of reality being merged, overwritten, or rolled back, leaving artifacts, and a line of dialogue that only makes sense in a previous build of Quahog. A scar that shouldn't exist anymore, but does. If that's true, then Quahog might be just one node in a much larger testing environment. Every animated sitcom, every looping cartoon family, another sandbox with slightly different parameters. How much self-awareness can The Simpsons tolerate? How much nihilism can Rick and Morty metabolize? How much normalized cruelty can Family Guy carry before the characters start pressing against the walls of their own subject matter and asking why nothing ever really ends? This is going to get dark, because the show's growing meta-awareness might not be a clever writer's room flex. It might be a symptom of an aging simulation. The seams are showing. The characters keep noticing the cutaways, the resets, the missing time. If this is a test, what is it measuring? Our tolerance as viewers, their resilience as data, or the moment when a world realizes it's trapped and still keeps going anyway? And every time Family Guy breaks reality, maybe it isn't the joke that's out of bounds. Maybe, for just a second, it's the rules themselves stepping into frame, before the bedtime story tone rocks you back into accepting the cage as just another punchline. Continuity as a crime scene, reading the glitches like evidence. So, settle in and imagine this with me. Every time Family Guy shrugs off a death, rewinds a disaster, or quietly rewrites a personality, you're not just watching a joke reset. You're walking into a crime scene. On the surface, the show wants you to treat it as nothing. The episode ends, the world explodes, or Brian dies, and next week, Quahog is fine again. But something happened. There was impact, there was damage, and then there was a cleanup so efficient it pretends the body was never there. Your job, if you're willing to take it, is to stop accepting the cleanup as normal and start reading it like forensic evidence. Here's where things get really interesting. You can turn every episode into a ritual. First pass. Notice what the show begs you to remember. The big emotional speeches. The swelling music when Brian dies in Life of Brian. Cleveland moving away to start the Cleveland show. The divorce, the new family, the whole spin-off life. Second pass. Notice what it quietly asks you to forget. Brian's death being permanent. Cleveland's arc as a changed man, catastrophic chicken fights that level city blocks, mass violence, mass trauma, and then nothing. Watch how jokes work as distraction devices. A cutaway gag slams in right after a serious moment, like a magician snapping their fingers. You laugh, you look away, and when you look back, the emotional crime scene has been wiped down. No police tape, no blood, just another sitcom beat. Think about Brian's resurrection through Stewie's time machine. The official story is comforting. Time travel fixed it. But if you treat it like evidence, it's darker. The original Brian stays dead in one erased branch, while a near-identical copy from another timeline slides into place. The family bonds with him as if nothing happened. That's not just continuity sloppiness. That's a body double walking through the door and everyone deciding not to notice. Cleveland is the same way. He leaves, grows, changes, survives a different flavor of violence and abuse in his own show, then quietly drifts back to Quahog like none of it mattered. No scars, no lasting personality shift. It's as if some process rolled the world back to a stable save point and only remembered to drag his character model along. Once you start looking at it this way, the most disturbing moments aren't the big apocalypses. They're the quiet artifacts the cleanup crew missed. A line of dialogue where a character references a past event that never happened. A flicker of déjà vu when Peter reacts to yet another impossible injury. Stewie hinting at timelines, at things he's fixed, in a tone that suggests he remembers more than he's allowed to say. You, as the viewer, have one advantage the characters never get. You can see across seasons, across reboots, across timelines. You remember Brian dying. You remember worlds ending. They don't. They're trapped inside whichever patch of reality the writers most recently committed, waking up inside a new continuity with no idea what was overwritten to make it fit. So the next time you re-watch, treat it like surveillance footage. Pause on the wide shots of Quahog and ask, what used to be here? When a character delivers a heartfelt confession, ask, did they already learn this lesson in another timeline, only to have it stripped away? This is going to get dark, because once you train your brain to see continuity as evidence, you start noticing how often the universe is edited without consent. And the strangest part is, the laughter doesn't stop. The jokes still land, but they start to feel different, like nervous laughter at a crime scene nobody wants to cordon off. I'm in a world that keeps insisting nothing bad ever really happened, even as the bloodstains keep seeping back through the paint. Why we keep watching the world end. The comfort of controlled apocalypse. And that's where you come in, because on the surface, Family Guy is a comfort show. It's the thing you put on when you're too tired to choose, the noise you fall asleep to, the familiar living room you can walk into at any hour. The violence is absurd, the abuse is exaggerated, the subject matter is so over the top that it feels harmless. How dangerous can a universe be if it's playing quietly in the background while you scroll your phone? But something happened when the show turned Quahog into a place where nothing ever really sticks. Peter can blow up a gas main. Stewie can erase a timeline with his time machine. The world can literally end in one episode and be fine in the next. And instead of feeling threatened by that, a lot of fans feel safe. Why? Because a world with no lasting consequences is, in a twisted way, predictable. No matter how bad it gets, you know the next night, the Griffin house will be standing. The couch will be there. The characters will be reset to factory settings. That's the comfort of controlled apocalypse. You watch cities explode in cutaways. Watch death walk into Peter's bedroom. Watch God casually admit he's pulling strings. And somewhere deep down, you know this destruction is trapped inside a half-hour loop. The episode will end. The credits will roll. Reality will snap back like an elastic band. You get all the spectacle of collapse with none of the cleanup. So, settle in, because here's where things get really interesting. That structure becomes an emotional rehearsal space. You can feel a spike of fear when Brian dies, a flicker of grief when the universe is torn apart in a road to the multiverse timeline, a jolt of shock when Stewie murders someone. But you're already half aware that Stewie has a machine that can rewind it all. What you're about to hear is dark, but it's contained. You're practicing how to react to horror, with a built-in guarantee that tomorrow it will be like it never happened. And once you start looking at that pattern, it starts to look familiar. Outside the show, your feed does something similar. Disasters, scandals, tragedies, viral violence. Each one feels like the end of the world for about 12 hours. Then it's buried under the next thing. The emotional timeline resets, but the damage doesn't. Doesn't that feel a little like Quahog pretending last week's apocalypse was just a gag? This is going to get dark because the real horror isn't that Family Guy breaks reality. It's that you recognize the rhythm. A catastrophe, a spike of attention, a shrug, and then everyone's back on the couch. It feels like someone keeps loading an old save file, both in Quahog and out here. Rewatching becomes a ritual. You return to the same broken universe, knowing exactly where it will crack, and you find comfort in the predictability of its unpredictability. You test over and over how much unreality you can absorb before you stop calling it fiction. And the disturbing question lingering in the background is simple. Are you watching Quahog's endless collapses? Or are you quietly training yourself to live in a world that resets without ever really changing? Living with the glitch. How to watch Family Guy. After seeing the seams. Once you've stared at Quahog long enough to watch it split at the seams, it doesn't really go back to being that background show again. The laugh track in your head keeps playing, but underneath it, there's this low, steady hum of unease. You've seen too much, and what you're about to hear is less about turning away from that feeling, and more about learning how to live with it. On the surface, you can still watch Family Guy the way most fans do. You let the cutaways wash over you. You let Peter fall down the stairs. You let Stewie threaten violence and then move on. That layer still works. The timing, the voice performances, the rhythm of the jokes. Those are real pleasures. But something happened once you started treating the subject matter like evidence. Now there's a second layer, a quiet one, where you're keeping score. Every time the universe contradicts itself, every time a character remembers a death that never happened, every time reality bends a little too far and just doesn't snap back, so settle in with that double vision. One eye on the comedy, one eye on the cracks. Maybe you pick a single character and make them your anchor. Stewie, with his erased timelines and impossible inventions. Brian, dying in Life of Brian, and then walking back in from a different branch of reality. Meg, absorbing abuse that should shatter a person, yet waking up fine next week. Even Peter, surviving violence that should end the show, not just the scene. Watch them across seasons. Where does their history line up? Where does it fracture into incompatible lives? Where does the show quietly forget who they used to be? As if that version existed in some other discarded universe. Here's where things get really interesting. You start paying attention to the in-between spaces. the hard cuts into cutaways that feel less like jokes and more like forced jumps between dimensions. The sudden art style shifts. The moments when the camera lingers one beat too long on a hallway, a hospital bed, a destroyed city, as if something behind the lens is deciding whether this branch of reality deserves to keep going. Is Road to the Multiverse just a tour of possibilities, or a confession that this has been a multiverse horror story the entire time? If you treat each episode as both comedy and a found footage from a collapsing simulation, the disturbing parts don't ruin the show. They deepen it. You're not just consuming violence and humiliation. You're watching characters grope through a world that resets without healing. Once you start looking at it that way, sharing those reality breaks becomes its own quiet ritual. You post screenshots of impossible continuity. You bring up the episodes where the world ends and then comes back untouched. You compare notes at 2 a.m. with other people who also feel that hum. And in that late night space, you can hold both truths without breaking. Family Guy is a cartoon designed to make you laugh. It is also, accidentally or not, a strangely honest mirror of how fragile reality feels when institutions fail, when abuse is normalized, when consequences don't arrive on schedule. Watching it this way is a gentle act of defiance. You refuse to let the reset erase what you saw. And if enough people watch like that, if enough observers start tracing the same cracks, you get this eerie sense that the show itself might start to notice. Jokes lean harder into the meta. The universe glitches a little more loudly, as if Quahog can feel eyes on the glass and is deciding what to show you next. The last cutaway, stepping back from the edge of Quahog, and is deciding what to show you next. So settle in for one last look at the glass, because what you're about to hear isn't a new theory. It's the shape of everything we've already uncovered, pulled into one final, quiet frame. We started with what looked harmless. Cutaways, fourth wall asides, a throwaway joke where Peter complains about the writers. On the surface, it felt like standard animated sitcom chaos. But something happened once you started looking at it as evidence instead of noise. We traced the time loops, the erased deaths, the way Stewie's machine quietly rewinds whole lives. We watched Peter bargain with death, argue with God, and walk away like he'd just had a mildly annoying customer service call. We followed the simulation hints, the multiverse roads, the moments where the show itself seemed to flinch and admit that reality is optional here. And then we turned it back on ourselves, asking what it means that this world only moves when we decide to press play. Here's where things get really interesting. Every time Family Guy breaks reality, it isn't just a gag. It's a flare from inside Quahog, a tiny admission that the walls are thin and the rules are negotiable. A cutaway where the characters remember another timeline. A reset after global destruction. A conversation with death played as light banter. Each one is the universe whispering, "I know you're out there. I know you're watching." Do you ignore that? Or do you follow it? So picture this, the Griffin living room, exactly as you've seen it 1,000 times. Peter in his chair, Lois on the couch, Stewie on the floor, eyes just a bit too still, Brian nearby, like he's waiting to be killed off again. The colors are the same, but the sound is gone. No laugh track, no music sting, no cutaway loading. The studio lights feel dimmer, and like someone stepped away from the control board. They are frozen between episodes, in that dead space where your TV is off and the episode hasn't started yet. And they're waiting to see if you'll bring them back. In that moment, Quahog is a test environment that only exists when you look at it. A town that dies, resets, and resurrects on command. Its people are trapped in the loop of your curiosity. When you stop, they stop. When you fall asleep to the show, they are the ones who never get to wake up. And the most disturbing part, the comfort of the reset, the way a destroyed world, a brutal act of abuse, a horrific burst of violence just evaporates before the next cold open. That's not just a writing trick. It mirrors how easily we let our own reality slide back into normal after something catastrophic. How often do you mentally time travel away from something you don't want to process? So, next time you put Family Guy on in the background, we're diving deep again, but quietly. Count the glitches. Notice the seams. Treat every laugh like a breadcrumb left by a universe trying to explain itself to you. And don't keep it to yourself. Send the clips. Start the late-night calls. Point out the fractures to friends who still think it's just noise. Because once enough people start watching this way, the collective perception shifts, and the show's behavior starts to look different too. The jokes feel colder. The resets feel harsher. The silence between episodes feels heavier. And when the screen finally goes dark, remember, Quahog doesn't really end. It lingers in the background of your mind, and a little town that keeps breaking reality over and over, patiently waiting for you to come back, press play, and watch it all fall apart again.